When I walked into the courtroom, my daughter smirked, and my son-in-law just shook his head. The judge went pale. His hand trembled as he whispered, "My God, is it really her?" Everyone turned and stared at me. No one had a clue who I really was. The crystal chandelier above my table cast a warm golden glow across the fellowship hall of Grace Community Church. It was our annual charity gala, an event filled with the most prominent citizens in the city. The mayor was sitting 2 tables away, the chief of police was chatting near the buffet, and I, Catherine Brooks, was scheduled to be the keynote speaker in exactly 10 minutes. I was supposed to stand at the podium and present a generous check to fund the new community center wing. It was a proud moment, a peaceful moment, or at least that was the illusion. My daughter Chloe leaned over my shoulder, her heavy floral perfume momentarily overpowering the scent of roasted chicken and fresh lilies on the table. She set a delicate porcelain teacup directly in front of me. Her smile was absolutely radiant, the perfect picture of a devoted daughter caring for her 68-year-old mother. "Drink this, Mom," Chloe said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "It is your favorite chamomile blend. I asked the catering staff to brew it specially for you. It will help soothe your throat before you have to give your speech." "You are so thoughtful, Chloe," I replied, reaching for the saucer. I lifted the cup. The ceramic was warm against my fingers. I brought it toward my lips, ready to take a long sip. Suddenly, a heavy weight crashed into my shoulder. A sharp gasp echoed across the table as hot tea splashed down the front of my silver silk dress. The porcelain cup hit the floor and shattered into a dozen jagged pieces. I jumped back, startled, as my 19-year-old grandson Caleb stumbled against my chair. He looked completely uncoordinated, a clumsy teenager who had tripped over his own oversized dress shoes. "I am so sorry, Grandma," Caleb shouted, his voice cracking with teenage awkwardness. "I tripped on the carpet seam. Let me help you clean that up." He dropped to his knees immediately, grabbing a handful of thick white cloth napkins from the table. He began dabbing frantically at the spilled tea on my lap. Chloe let out an exaggerated sigh of frustration, rolling her eyes at her son, while the rest of the table offered polite, sympathetic murmurs. "Caleb, honestly, you are so careless," Chloe scolded, her voice tight with an irritation that seemed vastly disproportionate to a simple spilled drink. But down on his knees, shielded by the edge of the tablecloth, Caleb was not acting like a clumsy teenager at all. His hands were perfectly steady. He pressed a dry napkin directly into my palm. He leaned his face close to my knees, pretending to scrub at the silk fabric, and whispered a sentence that made the blood freeze in my veins. "Do not eat or drink anything else tonight, Grandma." I was standing behind the kitchen door. "I just saw Mom crush 3 Ambien pills and stir them into your tea." He stood up quickly, his face an absolute mask of teenage embarrassment, apologizing loudly to the table one more time. I sat perfectly still. The hot liquid was seeping through my dress, burning my skin, but I hardly felt it. 3 Ambien, a massive dose of a powerful prescription sleep aid. If I were an ordinary 68-year-old widow, I might have gasped. I might have confronted my daughter right there, demanding to know why she was trying to drug me. I might have panicked. But I am not an ordinary widow. Before I retired, I spent 30 years as a forensic accountant and a corporate liquidator. My entire career was built on walking into the boardrooms of corrupt multi-million-dollar companies, hunting down hidden offshore accounts, and dismantling the lives of arrogant white-collar criminals. In my professional circles, they called me the Iron Widow. I had faced down ruthless cartel money launderers and desperate hedge fund managers. I knew exactly what betrayal smelled like. And right now, it smelled like chamomile tea. I took a slow, deep breath using the exact same breathing technique I used before testifying in federal court. I kept my face arranged in a gentle, slightly flustered, grandmotherly smile. I did not look at Chloe. Instead, I let my eyes sweep casually across the room, analyzing the environment like a crime scene. I looked at my son-in-law, Brandon. He was a commercial real estate broker who wore suits he could not afford and drove a leased sports car to project an image of wealth. He was standing near the exit doors, nervously checking his expensive watch. He caught Chloe's eye from across the room. I saw the silent, angry exchange between them. Brandon was furious that the tea had been spilled. I followed Brandon's line of sight into the shadowy corner near the coat check. A man was standing there. He was not a member of our church congregation. He wore a cheap gray suit, and he was gripping a black medical bag. He had the unmistakable posture of a private medical contractor, someone hired for a very specific job. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying clarity. This was not a simple prank. This was a highly coordinated social ambush. If I had consumed that tea, the heavy dose of sedatives would have hit my bloodstream right as I walked up the stairs to the podium. I would have stood in front of a microphone facing 200 of the most influential people in our city. I would have started slurring my words. My balance would have failed. I would have babbled, hallucinated, and eventually collapsed in a confused, incoherent mess. And right at that moment, Chloe and Brandon would have rushed to the stage playing the role of devastated, heartbroken children. Brandon would have immediately signaled his hired medical contractor from the corner to rush forward and assess me. The entire church would have witnessed Catherine Brooks losing her mind. The mayor would have seen it. The police chief would have seen it. The pastor would have prayed for my failing cognitive health. They were manufacturing a public medical emergency. They were creating undeniable community-wide witness testimony that I was suffering from severe rapid-onset dementia. It was the perfect pretext to legally strip away my independence and seize control of my estate. "Mom, you are completely soaked," Chloe said, her voice pulling me back to the present. Her tone was a masterful blend of concern and deep frustration. "Let me go ask the catering staff to brew you another cup of tea to calm your nerves. You still have to give your speech." "No," I said softly. My voice was intentionally weak, carrying just a hint of a tremor. I reached up and pressed my fingers against my temple, letting my eyes flutter shut for a fraction of a second. "I am feeling incredibly dizzy, actually." Chloe stepped closer, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Are you sure, Mom? It is just a little spilled tea. You cannot miss your speech. The community center needs this donation." "I cannot do it, Chloe." My heart is racing. I think my blood pressure just plummeted. I gripped the edge of the table, swaying just enough to make the other guests at the table gasp in concern. I played the role they wanted me to play, the frail, aging woman whose body was betraying her. I am so terribly embarrassed, but I need to go home immediately. Brandon had crossed the room in a matter of seconds. He appeared behind my chair, his large hands gripping my shoulders a little too tightly. His voice was loud, projecting deep familial concern for the benefit of the surrounding tables. "Catherine, you do not look well at all," Brandon announced. "Let me call a doctor. We should have a medical professional evaluate you right here before you try to move." He was trying to force the interaction. He wanted his hired contractor to put hands on me. He wanted a documented medical incident report filed tonight. I looked up at him, injecting pure grandmotherly stubbornness into my voice. "Absolutely not, Brandon. I will not make a public spectacle of myself in the middle of a church gala. I just need my bed." "Caleb, sweetheart, you spilled the tea, so you are going to make it up to me. You are going to drive your grandmother home right now." I stood up, leaning heavily on Caleb's arm. Caleb played his part brilliantly, wrapping his arm around my waist and supporting my weight. Chloe stepped directly into our path, blocking the aisle. "Mom, Caleb is just a teenager. He cannot handle a medical emergency. Brandon and I will take you to the hospital." I met her eyes. I let the facade of the frail old woman slip for just a microsecond, flashing her the cold, dead stare of the corporate liquidator she had forgotten I used to be. Chloe physically flinched, stepping back before she even realized what she was doing. I said, "I am going home with my grandson, Chloe. Do not make a scene in front of the pastor." I used the social pressure of the church against them. Brandon and Chloe could not physically restrain me, and they could not argue without looking like controlling monsters in front of their wealthy peers. They were trapped by the very public audience they had hoped to use against me. We walked through the fellowship hall. I kept my steps deliberately slow, letting my weight rest on Caleb. The whispers followed us out the door, people expressing pity for poor Catherine Brooks, whose health was clearly taking a turn for the worse. The cold night air hit my face as we pushed through the heavy glass exit doors. The moment we were out of sight of the church windows, I stopped limping. I stood perfectly straight, my spine stiffening, the false frailty vanishing instantly. I walked briskly across the asphalt toward my black sedan. Caleb unlocked the car. We got inside and the heavy doors slammed shut, sealing us in the quiet leather interior. Caleb gripped the steering wheel, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He was shaking violently now that the adrenaline was wearing off. "Grandma, I am so sorry. I did not know what else to do. I heard them in the catering kitchen. Mom had the pills in a little plastic bag. You did exactly the right thing, Caleb," I said, my voice crisp and commanding. "You saved my life tonight, and you saved my mind. Turn the car on. Turn the heat up. We are driving straight to my house. He started the engine, pulling out of the church parking lot with squealing tires. "What are they trying to do to you?" Caleb asked, his voice thick with tears. "Why would Mom try to drug you?" "Because they want to take control of my finances," I stated plainly, staring out the window at the passing streetlights. "If I am declared legally incompetent, your mother becomes my medical and financial proxy. She gets the keys to the kingdom." "But why tonight?" Caleb asked, wiping his eyes with the back of his sleeve. "Why do it in front of the whole church?" "That is the million-dollar question," I replied, my mind working furiously. "White-collar criminals only take massive public risks when they are running out of time. Your father is a coward. He would never risk a public drugging unless a clock was ticking down to zero. They are desperate. Something terrible is about to happen, and they need my money to fix it." I reached into my designer purse and pulled out my laptop. I always kept it with me. I flipped the screen open, the bright light illuminating the dark interior of the car. I needed to check my master trust accounts. If Brandon was desperate enough to drug me, he might have already tried to probe the perimeter of my digital banking security. I logged into my secure network portal, my fingers flying across the keys with practiced precision. I entered my master administrative password. A red warning box flashed across the center of my screen. "Access denied." I stopped breathing. I tried my backup credentials. I routed my connection through my secondary authentication server. "Access denied. Password has been changed." I stared at the screen, a cold realization washing over me. They had not just planned to humiliate me tonight. They had already locked me out of my own life. Every single password to my $6 million estate had been altered. "Caleb," I said, my voice dangerously calm, "drive faster. The war has already started." Caleb gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white under the passing streetlights. He kept checking the rearview mirror, terrified his parents might be following us from the church. I sat in the passenger seat of his older model Honda sedan, my posture rigid, the frail old woman routine completely discarded. "Do not drive to the hospital," I commanded, my voice sharp and clear in the quiet car. "Take the back roads. Head straight to my house." "Grandma, are you sure?" Caleb asked. His voice shook with the raw adrenaline of a 19-year-old who had just sabotaged his own parents. Mom looked furious when we left. "What if they call the police and say I kidnapped you?" "They will not call the police," I replied, pulling my heavy leather tote onto my lap. People running a long con avoid law enforcement at all costs. Right now, Brandon is busy doing damage control at the gala. He is pulling aside the mayor and the pastor, explaining how his poor mother-in-law is suffering from a tragic mental decline. He is laying the groundwork for their narrative. I unzipped my bag and pulled out my laptop. The glow from the screen cast harsh shadows across the interior of the car. For 30 years as a corporate liquidator, this machine had been my primary weapon. I used it to tear apart corrupt executives and trace hidden offshore funds. Now I was using it to save my own life. "Keep your eyes on the road, Caleb. Take the next left." I connected to my secure mobile hotspot. I navigated straight to the private portal for my primary wealth management firm. My estate was worth just over $6 million, split between commercial real estate holdings, diversified mutual funds, and a series of high-yield bonds. I had spent a lifetime building that portfolio from the ground up, outsmarting greedy men in custom suits. I was not about to let my son-in-law steal it. I typed in my master administrative password. It was a complex alphanumeric sequence I changed every 90 days to ensure maximum security. The screen refreshed. A stark red banner appeared across the top. "Access denied." My breath caught in my throat. I pressed my lips together and typed in my secondary authentication phrase. I hit enter. "Access denied. Account locked. Password modified." A cold, heavy sensation settled into the pit of my stomach. Brandon and Chloe had not just planned a theatrical stunt with poison tea. That was merely the final stage of their operation. They had already breached the perimeter. They had locked me out of my own financial existence. "They changed the passwords," I said quietly. Caleb glanced over, his eyes wide with disbelief. "How is that even possible?" "You use two-factor authentication for everything. They would need your physical phone or your biometric security token." "Brandon is a commercial real estate broker," I explained, staring at the flashing red error message on my screen. "He knows the banking system inside and out. He knows how to bypass standard digital security if he possesses the right legal documents. He must have submitted something to the bank that overrides my personal credentials, something that grants him absolute administrative authority over my life." We pulled into my driveway. The house was completely dark, sitting silently at the end of the suburban cul-de-sac. I told Caleb to pull his car straight into the garage and shut the door before we got out. We needed to be completely invisible. We hurried into the kitchen. I did not bother turning on the main overhead lights, opting instead for the small under-cabinet bulbs that cast a dim, safe glow across the counter. "I need to know exactly what documents Brandon gave the bank," I said, setting my laptop on the granite island. "I cannot fight a legal battle if I am blind to their strategy." Caleb dropped his keys on the counter. He took a deep breath, his young face setting into a mask of pure determination. He was a freshman studying cybersecurity, a quiet kid who spent his weekends building encrypted networks in his bedroom. His parents constantly mocked him for it. Brandon always complained that his son needed to get out and learn real salesmanship instead of staring at screens. Brandon was a fool. "Let me see the computer," Caleb said. I slid the laptop across the island. "What are you going to do?" "Dad is arrogant," Caleb said, his fingers already flying across the keyboard. "He thinks he is a genius, but his digital hygiene is an absolute joke. He uses the same core password for his real estate portal, his personal banking, and his email. It is his college fraternity letters, followed by the year he graduated. I told him 100 times to use a password manager, but he said those were for paranoid nerds." I watched my grandson work. It was a beautiful, terrifying thing to witness. Within 90 seconds, Caleb had bypassed the commercial firewall of Brandon's real estate firm. He routed our connection through a virtual private network to mask our location. Then he dropped right into Brandon's primary email inbox. "I am in," Caleb whispered. He typed a few search queries, filtering the thousands of emails by recent attachments and legal keywords. "Okay, let us see what Dad has been sending to your bank." Caleb opened an email thread dated from 3 days ago. There was a high-resolution PDF attached. He clicked on it, and the document filled the screen. I leaned closer, my hands gripping the edge of the kitchen island. The header at the top of the page was printed in bold, uncompromising letters: "Full durable power of attorney for healthcare and financial management." "Oh my God," Caleb breathed out. I read through the legal jargon with the practiced eye of a forensic accountant. The document granted Chloe and Brandon sweeping authority over my finances and medical decisions. It gave them power to sell property, move money, communicate with institutions in my name, and present themselves as my authorized agents. It did not by itself erase every civil right I possessed, but combined with the conservatorship petition they were preparing, it gave them the foothold they needed to make that nightmare possible. I scrolled to the bottom of the last page. There was my signature, Catherine Brooks. It was flawless. The loop of the C, the sharp angle of the K, the slight trailing fade at the end of my last name. It was mathematically perfect. "Did you sign this?" Caleb asked, looking up at me with sheer terror in his eyes. "Did they drug you before tonight?" "No," I replied, my voice hard as granite. "I never signed this, but I know exactly where they got it." I pointed to a slight digital artifact near the bottom edge of the signature line. "Look right there. Your father is a real estate broker. 6 months ago, I helped him secure a commercial lease for a client who was struggling with credit. I signed a standard guarantor form for him. He took that original document, scanned it at high resolution, and digitally lifted my signature. He pasted it onto this power of attorney form. It is a brilliant forgery, Caleb. But to a forensic accountant, a perfectly replicated signature is the biggest red flag of all. Real signatures always have slight variations. A cloned signature is an exact pixel match to a previous document. But a bank would not accept a printed signature without a notary stamp, Caleb pointed out, scrolling further down the page. He stopped. There, stamped cleanly at the bottom of the document, was an official state notary seal. The signature belonged to a junior partner at Brandon's brokerage firm. "One of Dad's own partners notarized this," Caleb said, staring at the seal. "Exactly," I said, a bitter taste rising in the back of my throat. Brandon had persuaded a greedy colleague to notarize a forged document. That was how they bypassed the bank's ordinary security. They walked in with paperwork that appeared properly executed and used it to claim sweeping authority over my finances and medical decisions. Grandma, Caleb said, his voice suddenly dropping to an urgent whisper. "Look at the recipient list on this email chain. Dad did not just send this to the bank." I shifted my gaze to the top of the screen. Brandon had sent the forged power of attorney to a private probate attorney. And there was a response. Caleb clicked on the newest message in the thread. It had been sent just 2 hours ago, right before we left for the charity gala. The email was from the clerk of the Superior Court. Mr. Hayes, the email read, "Your emergency ex parte petition for permanent conservatorship has been received. Given the medical evidence provided and the urgent nature of the beneficiary's declining mental state, the judge has agreed to a closed-door hearing. Please be present in courtroom 4B at 9 in the morning on Monday. The conservatorship will be finalized and all asset control will be officially transferred at that time." The kitchen went completely silent. The only sound was the humming of the refrigerator. I stared at the timestamp on the email. 9 in the morning on Monday. I looked at the digital clock on the microwave. It was currently 9 at night on Saturday. 36 hours, I whispered. They scheduled an emergency court hearing to make the theft permanent. That is why they tried to drug me tonight. Caleb ran his hands through his hair, pacing the narrow space between the island and the stove. "I do not understand. If they already have the forged power of attorney, why do they need a court hearing?" "Because a power of attorney can be revoked." I explained, my mind racing through the legal maneuvers. If I woke up tomorrow and realized what they did, I could march down to the bank, prove my identity, and legally revoke the document. Brandon knows that. He knows I am too smart to let a simple forgery slide. I tapped the screen of the laptop. But a permanent conservatorship ordered by a judge cannot be revoked by the victim. Once a judge declares me legally incompetent, I lose the right to hire my own lawyer. I lose the right to access my own money. I lose the right to speak for myself. I become a ghost. "The poison tea," Caleb said, his eyes widening in realization. "Exactly," I nodded. Brandon submitted the forged paperwork to get the court date, but he needed undeniable proof to show the judge on Monday morning. He needed an entire room full of respectable church members, mayors, and police officers to testify that Catherine Brooks suffered a complete mental collapse in public. They were going to use the gala to seal my fate. "We have to go to the police," Caleb said, grabbing his phone from his pocket. "We have the forged document. We can show them." "Put the phone down, Caleb," I commanded gently but firmly. "Why?" he pleaded. "They committed fraud. Because we are out of time and the police move too slowly," I explained, leaning against the counter. "If we file a police report tonight, a detective might look at it by Tuesday. They will need to launch an investigation, interview the notary, and subpoena the bank. Meanwhile, Brandon and Chloe will walk into that courtroom on Monday morning, tell the judge I am suffering from paranoid dementia, and claim my police report is just a hallucination." I looked down at my hands. They were steady, but the reality of my situation was stark. By Tuesday, Brandon will have emptied every account I own. He will wire the money offshore. The police might eventually arrest him, but my $6 million will be gone forever, and I will be trapped in a psychiatric facility. "So what do we do?" Caleb asked. He looked so young in that moment, a teenager carrying the weight of his parents' terrible crimes. He had risked everything to warn me, choosing to betray his own mother to save my life. I owed it to him to fight back with every ounce of cunning I possessed. I walked out of the kitchen and headed straight into my home office. I did not turn on the lights. I moved entirely by memory, stepping around the heavy oak desk and crouching down near the large mahogany bookshelf against the far wall. "Grandma, what are you doing?" Caleb asked, following me into the dark room. I reached behind the third shelf, my fingers tracing the familiar wooden paneling until I found the hidden latch. I pressed hard. A small concealed drawer slid open with a soft click. I reached inside and pulled out a heavy black device. It was not a standard smartphone. It was an encrypted satellite phone, thick and rugged, completely untraceable by traditional cellular towers. "In my line of work, you make a lot of powerful enemies," I said, turning to face my grandson. The dim moonlight spilling through the window illuminated his stunned expression. "When you dismantle corrupt corporations, you learn to always have a backup plan that does not rely on the standard banking or telecom systems." "Does that phone even have service?" Caleb asked. "It connects directly to a low Earth orbit satellite," I replied, powering the device on. The screen glowed an eerie green. "And the number I am about to call belongs to a man who does not exist on any public directory." I pressed a sequence of numbers into the keypad. I had 36 hours until my daughter stood in front of a judge and tried to erase my existence. I had no access to my credit cards. My bank accounts were locked. I could not sleep in my own house tonight, knowing they had a key and would undoubtedly come looking for me when they realized their plan at the gala had failed. I needed cash. I needed a ruthless ally, and I needed a trap, so devastating that Brandon would never see it coming until the steel jaws snapped shut around his neck. The phone rang twice. A deep, gravelly voice answered on the other end. "It is late, Catherine. You only call this number when the world is ending. The world is fine, David." I said, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. "But I need to perform a corporate liquidation by Monday morning, and I need you to help me buy the noose." I walked out of my dark home office and strode directly into the formal dining room. The heavy mahogany table sitting in the center of the room had hosted decades of Thanksgiving dinners and birthday celebrations. Tonight, it would serve as my war room. I flipped the switch on the wall. The crystal chandelier overhead flooded the space with bright, unforgiving light. There was no more time to hide in the shadows. If Brandon wanted to play a high-stakes game of corporate theft, he was about to learn why entire boards of directors used to sweat when I walked into their buildings. Caleb followed me into the dining room carrying his laptop like it was a live explosive. He set it down on the polished wood surface and looked at me, his face pale and drawn. "Why is Dad doing this?" Caleb asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He always wanted to be successful, but this is insane. He is risking federal prison. He is risking your life. Why act so incredibly fast? Why fake a medical emergency in front of the entire church instead of just trying to slowly drain your accounts over time? "That is exactly what we are going to find out right now," I said, pulling out a high-backed dining chair and sitting down. People do not execute sloppy high-risk frauds because they are greedy. They do it because they are terrified. Brandon is backed into a corner. We just need to figure out who is holding the gun to his head. I pointed to the laptop screen. "Can you get back into his private brokerage network? I do not want to see his standard email inbox this time. I want to see his restricted commercial transaction logs. I want his tax routing numbers and his encrypted client portfolios." Caleb swallowed hard, nodding. He pulled out a chair next to me and began typing rapidly. He is the managing director of his own branch, so he has absolute administrative clearance. If I can mirror his local IP address, I can pull the raw financial data straight from his desktop at the office. Give me 2 minutes. I sat perfectly still, watching the lines of code and security bypasses reflect in my grandson's glasses. 30 years ago, I had to physically seize filing cabinets and dig through thousands of paper receipts to catch corrupt executives hiding stolen assets. Today, the battlefield was digital, but the psychology of a thief remained exactly the same. They always thought they were smarter than the system. They always left a trail. "I am in," Caleb announced, tapping the enter key one final time. He opened a massive spreadsheet file containing thousands of rows of financial data. This is his master ledger for the past 36 months. It includes all his incoming commissions, his outgoing expenses, and his corporate tax filings. "Turn the screen toward me," I instructed. As the vast ocean of numbers illuminated my face, the grandmotherly persona I had worn for the past decade vanished completely. The Iron Widow took over. My eyes scanned the columns, moving past the trivial daily expenses and focusing entirely on the structural flow of capital. I looked for the anomalies. I looked for the desperate attempts to patch sinking ships. It only took me 4 minutes to find the first massive red flag. "Look right here," I said, pointing a manicured finger at a cluster of transactions dated 18 months ago. "Your father is a commercial real estate broker. His income should come from standard percentage commissions on property sales. But look at this influx of cash. 3 separate deposits of $500,000 each, all originating from a holding company registered in Delaware." Caleb leaned in, squinting at the screen. "What does that mean?" "It means he was losing money on his legitimate deals," I explained, tracing the line across the screen to the outgoing expense column. "Look at where that money went immediately after it hit his account. He dumped it straight into a series of highly speculative commercial developments downtown. Developments that went completely bankrupt last year." I scrolled down further, my eyes darting across the dates and routing numbers. The picture was becoming terrifyingly clear. Brandon had not just made a few bad investments. He had completely obliterated his own net worth. But instead of admitting defeat, he had doubled down. He had started borrowing money to cover his catastrophic losses. "But who did he borrow it from?" Caleb asked, scrolling through the associated tax identification numbers. Traditional banks do not lend millions of dollars to a broker with a failing portfolio. "No, they do not." I agreed, my voice dropping an octave as I spotted the true source of the poison. "But predatory private equity funds do. Pull up the registration data for this specific routing number, the one associated with a transfer of $4 million directly into your father's personal operating account 6 months ago." Caleb quickly copied the routing string and pasted it into a financial database search tool. The results populated a second later. The entity is called Whitman Capital. Caleb read aloud, his brow furrowing in confusion. They are registered as a private investment and asset management firm based out of Chicago. They are loan sharks in custom-tailored suits. I corrected him, feeling a surge of genuine disgust. Whitman Capital is notorious in the corporate liquidation world. They target desperate, failing businessmen who cannot get loans from legitimate banks. They offer massive cash injections with predatory interest rates and brutal collateral requirements. They do not care if the borrower succeeds. They actually want the borrower to fail so they can seize the collateral assets for pennies on the dollar. But Dad does not have $4 million worth of collateral, Caleb argued, shaking his head. He leases his car. He has a mortgage on his house. He has nothing of real value. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. The pieces of the puzzle were locking together, forming an image so dark and audacious, I could hardly believe my own son-in-law possessed the nerve to attempt it. I did not use his own assets for collateral, I said, my voice eerily calm. He used mine. I reached out and placed my hands on the keyboard. I ran a targeted search within Brandon's digital files for the name of my most valuable commercial property, a massive retail plaza downtown that I owned free and clear. It was worth exactly $4 million. The search results yielded a single heavily encrypted PDF document. Open it, I commanded. Caleb broke the local encryption in seconds. The document filled the screen. It was a comprehensive commercial loan agreement between Brandon Hayes and Whitman Capital. And right there, listed on page 4 under the collateral designation clause, was the deed to my downtown retail plaza. He forged your signature again, Caleb whispered, staring at the screen in absolute horror. He literally handed the deed to your most valuable building over to a predatory investment fund to secure a $4 million loan for himself. He did. I confirmed, reading through the brutal terms of the contract. And he used his corrupt junior partner to illegally notarize this document, just like he did with the forged power of attorney. Brandon thought he could borrow the $4 million, invest it in a new real estate scheme, make a massive profit, and quietly pay off Whitman Capital before I ever found out my building had a lien against it. But the new scheme failed, Caleb guessed, looking sick to his stomach. Miserably, I replied, scrolling through the zeroed-out balance sheets from the previous month. He lost every single penny of the Whitman Capital money. He is completely broke, and now the devil has come to collect his due. I needed to see exactly what kind of pressure Whitman Capital was applying. I instructed Caleb to search Brandon's private email inbox for any messages originating from the Whitman domain address over the past 48 hours. A single email appeared. It had been marked with high-priority flags and read receipts. It was sent by a senior collection partner at the equity fund. Caleb opened the message. We both leaned forward to read the text. It was not a polite banking notice. It was a corporate death warrant. Mr. Hayes, the email began, you are currently in default of your primary loan agreement. You have missed 3 consecutive interest payments. As per the stipulations of our contract, we are initiating immediate asset forfeiture. If a wire transfer of $2 million in liquid cash is not received in our primary holding account by exactly 10 in the morning on Monday, we will legally seize the commercial plaza listed as your collateral. Furthermore, our auditing department has uncovered severe irregularities regarding the notarized signatures on your collateral documents. If the $2 million penalty payment is not received by the 10 in the morning deadline, we will hand all documentation of your wire fraud and signature forgery directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Have a pleasant weekend. I let out a slow, steady breath. The entire room seemed to vibrate with the sheer magnitude of the discovery. They are going to seize your building and send Dad to federal prison, Caleb said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and profound anger. He is going to lose everything. I looked at the timestamp mentioned in the email, 10 in the morning on Monday. I looked back at Caleb, my eyes cold and sharp. Now, do you understand why your mother and father were so desperate to drug me at the church gala tonight? Caleb stared at me, the mathematical reality of his parents' evil plan finally clicking into place. The court hearing to declare you legally incompetent is scheduled for 9 in the morning on Monday, Caleb said, speaking slowly as he pieced the timeline together. If the judge approves the conservatorship, Mom gets immediate total access to all of your bank accounts at 9 in the morning. And by 9:15, I continued, Brandon will wire $2 million of my hard-earned money directly to Whitman Capital. He will use my cash to pay off his predatory debt, saving himself from an FBI fraud investigation and keeping himself out of federal prison. He needs me locked in a psychiatric ward by 9 in the morning so he can save his own miserable life at 10. It was a breathtakingly ruthless strategy. Brandon and Chloe were willing to destroy my mind, drug me in public, and steal my entire life savings just to cover up Brandon's catastrophic financial crimes. They viewed me as nothing more than a sacrificial lamb, an expendable asset to be slaughtered on the altar of their own greed. Grandma Caleb said, his voice suddenly dropping an octave. "We have to leave, now." I looked at him, noticing how pale he had become. "Why?" "We are perfectly safe here for the moment. They think I am sleeping off a dizzy spell." "No," Caleb said, shaking his head frantically. He pointed a trembling finger at the laptop screen. "Look at the bottom corner of his email client." I followed his gaze. There was a small green indicator light flashing next to Brandon's user icon. "Dad just logged into his account from his phone," Caleb said, his hands flying to the keyboard to sever our connection. "He can see that someone else is currently viewing his restricted folders. He knows his system has been breached. He knows we are looking at the Whitman Capital documents." Before I could even process the implication of Caleb's words, a harsh, blinding light swept across the sheer curtains of my dining room window. The distinctive, heavy roar of Brandon's leased sports car echoed through the quiet suburban street. The sound of screeching tires violently shattered the midnight silence as the vehicle slammed onto my driveway. The brakes shrieked in protest. Gravel crunched loudly under the weight of the heavy tires. 2 car doors slammed shut with explosive force. Heavy, hurried footsteps began pounding up my front walkway. They did not wait until morning. They had abandoned the subtle approach. They knew their timeline was exposed, and they had come to silence the only 2 people who could stop them from executing their Monday morning theft. "They are here," Caleb whispered, stepping back from the table. I stood up slowly, closing the laptop with a decisive, echoing snap. I did not feel fear. I felt the icy, calculating thrill of a corporate liquidator preparing for absolute war. Let them come. The hum of the central heating unit died exactly at 2 in the morning. A heavy, suffocating silence immediately swallowed the house. I sat completely still in the leather armchair of my study, fully dressed in dark slacks and a cashmere sweater. I had not slept a single minute. Beside me, Caleb knelt on the rug, his face illuminated only by the faint blue glow of his modified smartphone screen. "He cut the main breaker," Caleb whispered, his fingers flying across the digital interface of his custom application. The hardwired alarm panel just went offline. They bypassed the external security gate. They are going to use the physical spare key you keep hidden inside the ceramic planter on the porch. Before lowering his screen, he activated a local audio recorder on the phone and slipped it into his pocket. Even without the house power or an internet connection, the file would keep recording until the battery died. I did not feel a spike of panic. Panic is a useless emotion reserved for people who do not plan ahead. 30 years of facing down ruthless corporate embezzlers had taught me that a cornered rat is highly predictable. Brandon was out of time, out of money, and desperate to secure my forced absence before his 10 o'clock deadline with Whitman Capital. "Stay low and stay completely silent," I commanded, standing up from my chair and moving toward the doorway. "We are going to let them walk right into the center of the web." The metallic scrape of the front door unlocking echoed down the long hallway. Heavy boots thudded softly against the imported hardwood floor. 3 distinct sets of footsteps entered my home. Flashlight beams began slicing through the absolute darkness, casting erratic, sweeping shadows across the walls and family photographs. "Spread out and check the ground floor," Brandon instructed in a harsh, urgent whisper. "Chloe, you take the guest wing. Check the master bedroom last. If she wakes up and tries to scream, just hold her down. Doctor, get the syringe ready. We need her completely docile before we strap her into the transport van." I stood in the shadows of the corridor, listening to my own daughter coordinate my violent kidnapping. A private transport van, a hired medical contractor, a syringe filled with heavy sedatives. It was a terrifyingly brilliant strategy. They planned to drag me out of my own bed, inject me with enough chemicals to simulate a total mental collapse, and lock me away in some remote private psychiatric facility miles outside the city limits. By the time I could physically wake up and demand legal representation, Monday morning would be over. The judge would have granted the permanent conservatorship, and my commercial properties would belong to Whitman Capital. They moved deeper into the house. I guided Caleb by the shoulder, steering us silently toward the architectural centerpiece of my home. The formal living room was a sunken, expansive space designed for hosting large charity events. It featured massive floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass pocket doors that could be sealed off from the rest of the house to manage acoustics. We stepped down into the sunken room. I positioned myself perfectly in the center, allowing the pale moonlight spilling through the overhead skylight to illuminate my silhouette. I took a slow breath and spoke. "I am right here, Chloe," I said. My voice was calm, projecting easily across the open floor plan. 3 flashlight beams immediately snapped toward me, blinding me for a fraction of a second. The heavy footsteps rushed forward. Brandon, Chloe, and the hired medical contractor poured into the sunken living room, fanning out to surround me. The man in the cheap suit reached into his black medical bag, his movements practiced and cold. Mom Chloe called out, her voice trembling with an atrocious imitation of filial concern. She actually managed to sound heartbroken. "Why are you awake in the dark? You are clearly having another terrible episode. We brought a specialist to help you get better." I crossed my arms, staring at the woman I had raised from birth. "You actually think you can drag me out of my own home in the middle of the night?" I asked, infusing my tone with a deliberate, trembling vulnerability. I wanted them to step fully away from the doorway. I needed all 3 of them completely inside the perimeter of the room. "Catherine, you are experiencing a severe psychiatric delusion," Brandon declared, reading from his imaginary script, just in case a nosy neighbor happened to be listening through an open window. "We have the emergency legal paperwork right here. This doctor is going to give you a mild sedative to calm your nerves. We are taking you to a specialized care facility in the mountains where you can be properly treated and evaluated." I looked at the doctor. He took a calculated step toward me, a loaded syringe gleaming dull silver in his gloved hand. He had dead empty eyes. He did not care about the legality of the situation. He only cared about the cash Brandon had promised him. "We do not want to use physical force, Mom," Chloe pleaded, clutching her designer purse and stepping deeper into the room. "But you are simply not in your right mind anymore. You are a danger to yourself. Just hold still and let the doctor do his job." I let out a soft, dry laugh. The sound caught them off guard, halting the doctor's advance for just a single heartbeat. "You really are a spectacular failure of a businessman, Brandon," I said, dropping the frightened widow act entirely. My voice snapped through the room like a whip. "Did you honestly believe I would not check my own banking logs? Did you really think you could forge my signature on a power of attorney hand, my commercial plaza over to Whitman Capital, and I would just quietly slip into a medically induced coma?" Brandon's jaw dropped. The flashlight in his hand wavered. His arrogant posture evaporated, replaced by sheer naked terror. He stared at me as if I were a ghost who had just crawled out of a grave. "How do you know about Whitman Capital?" Brandon choked out, his voice cracking. "Because I am a corporate liquidator, you absolute fool," I sneered. "I hunt financial predators for a living. I eat men like you for breakfast. Grab her." Brandon yelled, panic completely taking over. "Get the needle in her arm right now." "Do it, Caleb," I commanded without breaking eye contact with my son-in-law. From the deep shadows near the corridor, my grandson tapped a single button on his smartphone screen. The trap slammed shut. The heavy reinforced glass pocket doors of the living room shot out from the walls with a brutal pneumatic hiss. A sharp metallic clack echoed through the space as the heavy-duty industrial electromagnets engaged simultaneously. Brandon spun around his flashlight beam, wildly tracking the closed glass doors. What the hell was that? He lunged forward, grabbing the brass handle of the sliding door and yanking with all his might. The door did not move a single millimeter. He dropped his shoulder and slammed his entire body weight against the transparent barrier. The impact produced nothing but a dull, heavy thud. "It is architectural safety glass," Brandon, I explained, stepping out of the direct moonlight and walking casually toward the secondary utility exit, hidden behind the stone fireplace. "It is rated to withstand Category 4 hurricane winds and blunt force trauma. You could beat on that glass with a sledgehammer until sunrise, and it will not splinter." "Open this door!" Chloe shrieked, dropping her purse and slapping her palms frantically against the glass. "Open it right now, Mother. You cut the main breaker to disable the alarm system," I reminded her coldly, pausing by the stone hearth. "But you clearly forgot that high-end security doors run on an independent battery backup system. Caleb reprogrammed the entire internal network while we were waiting for you to arrive. You cannot bypass the electromagnetic lock without the digital master key. The hired doctor dropped his syringe and began kicking the base of the glass door, realizing immediately that he had walked into a legal and physical prison. He was trapped at the scene of an attempted kidnapping. Catherine Brandon bellowed, his voice muffled by the thick acoustic glass. He pressed his face against the barrier, his eyes wide with desperate rage. "You cannot leave us in here. When the police finally arrive, we will just show them the medical paperwork. We will tell them you locked us in during a violent manic episode. You will only make yourself look crazier." I smiled. It was a terrifying, genuine smile that chilled the room. "Who said I am calling the police, Brandon?" I asked softly. "I am leaving you here to think about your life choices. By the time the battery backup naturally drains and the doors unlock in 12 hours, I will be long gone." I pressed a hidden mechanical lever carved into the side of the stone fireplace. A narrow section of the wall popped open, revealing a dark maintenance tunnel that ran directly beneath the house and connected to the garage storm drain. It was an old architectural quirk I had insisted on keeping during the renovations decades ago. Caleb slipped into the tunnel first, using his phone screen to light the narrow path. I stepped in behind him, pausing one last time to look at my daughter. Chloe was pressing her face against the glass, her makeup running her hands, pleading. She had tried to steal my mind. She had tried to lock me in a chemical prison for the rest of my natural life. I felt absolutely nothing for her. I pulled the hidden doors shut, sealing them inside the house. We crawled through the damp, narrow concrete passage. The smell of wet earth and old masonry filled my lungs. The tunnel sloped downward, bypassing the main garage foundation entirely before finally opening up into a drainage culvert near the back edge of my property line. We climbed out of the drain and stepped into the bitter, freezing night. A harsh rain had started to fall, the icy drops cutting through the air and soaking into our clothes almost immediately. The street was completely empty. No cars, no neighbors, just the relentless downpour and the distant rumble of thunder. We stood in the dark alley behind my property line. Caleb shivered violently, pulling his thin jacket tight against the bitter wind. He looked down at his phone. The screen was dark. The battery had died moments after he executed the final lock command, but the local recording had already been saved. Grandma Caleb said, his teeth chattering uncontrollably as the freezing rain plastered his hair to his forehead. "We cannot go back inside. My checking account has maybe $40 in it. Your accounts are completely frozen. We have no car, no shelter, and nowhere to hide. We have absolutely nothing left." I turned my face up to the falling rain, letting the icy water wash away the last lingering traces of the gentle grandmother I used to be. My family had tried to bury me alive. They had stripped my access to my life savings, weaponized the legal system against me, and forced me into the street like a stray dog. They thought taking my money would render me powerless. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of power. I looked at my grandson wiping the cold rain from my eyes. I reached into the pocket of my slacks and felt the heavy, reassuring weight of the encrypted satellite phone. "They want to strip my assets," I said, my voice cutting through the stormy night like a sharpened blade. "Then I will gladly show them what absolute liquidation looks like." The rain was coming down hard enough to erase our footprints within seconds. Caleb stood beside me in the alley, soaked through and shivering, staring at the dead screen of his phone as if it had personally betrayed him. I still had the satellite handset in my pocket, but no access to my ordinary accounts, no credit cards, and no safe place to spend the rest of the night. Brandon and Chloe were trapped inside my house for the moment, yet the battery system would not hold them forever. We needed to disappear before they escaped and turned the entire city into a search party for the supposedly delusional old woman who had locked her loving family behind glass. I pulled Caleb beneath the narrow awning of a closed storefront at the end of the block and powered on the satellite phone. David answered before the second ring. I had spoken to him earlier before the break-in, but now my voice carried a different weight. The situation was no longer theoretical. Brandon had crossed from fraud into attempted abduction. I told David we were alive, that the house was compromised, and that I needed him awake and ready. He told me to get somewhere secure and promised that his office would be open to us before dawn. I did not ask him for money. I had prepared for nights exactly like this, long before Chloe ever learned the difference between a trust and a checking account. 15 years earlier, during one of the ugliest corporate liquidations of my career, I had established an emergency reserve that existed outside the machinery of my everyday life. The case had involved executives who retaliated against auditors, witnesses who received threats, and financial records that disappeared hours before subpoenas arrived. I learned then that a person can be wealthy on paper and still become helpless if every ordinary point of access is compromised. So I created a private contingency cash duplicate identification, emergency legal records, and a small reserve held in a secure deposit box at a private banking facility that operated around the clock for clients with high security arrangements. Chloe did not know it existed. Brandon did not know it existed. It was not listed in the household files, and it had never been connected to the online portals they had managed to poison. I had not touched it in years. Tonight, it was the difference between being stranded in the rain and remaining a free woman. We moved through the wet streets on foot until we reached a main avenue where late-night traffic still passed. I refused to use Caleb's ordinary ride accounts or anything linked to his parents. Instead, I used a small amount of emergency cash I kept folded inside the lining of my wallet to pay for transportation without creating an electronic trail. The trip across the city felt longer than it was. Caleb sat close to me, exhausted and silent, while I watched every pair of headlights behind us. I was not afraid that Brandon had suddenly become brilliant. Desperate men did not become brilliant under pressure. They became impulsive. They repeated themselves. They made noise. My job was to remain quieter than his panic. By the time we reached the private bank, the rain had softened to a cold mist. The building looked almost anonymous from the street, all dark stone and narrow windows, nothing like the bright retail branches most people associated with banking. That anonymity was the point. The security process took several minutes and required nothing connected to my compromised online identity. I used the physical credentials and private access phrase I had established years ago. Once inside the secure vault corridor, I felt the first genuine relief of the night. Steel doors did not care about viral videos. Biometric locks did not care whether Chloe had cried convincingly at church. The box was exactly where I had left it. When I opened it, Caleb stared at the contents in silence. There were tightly banded stacks of cash sufficient to carry us through an emergency 2 backup passports, certified copies of my foundational trust documents, a sealed envelope containing old legal authorizations, and a canvas garment bag folded beneath the paperwork. I removed everything we needed and left nothing that could become leverage against me. The cash restored mobility, the passports restored options. The documents restored proof of identity and ownership. The garment bag held something less practical but equally important. The clothes I used to wear when I walked into hostile boardrooms and made men with private jets explain missing numbers. Caleb watched me divide the cash into 2 envelopes. I handed one to him. "Keep this separate from mine," I told him. "If we are separated, you do not use your bank card, you do not contact your parents, and you do not go anywhere they would expect." He looked at the envelope, then at me. "Grandma," he said quietly, "you planned for someone to do this to you." "Not them," I replied. "I planned for the possibility that power could be cut off, accounts could be frozen, or an enemy could try to isolate me." I spent 30 years watching executives discover too late that all their wealth depended on one password, one signature, one institution, or one person remaining loyal. I promised myself I would never make that mistake. The fact that my own daughter had become the enemy did not change the usefulness of the lesson. I called David again from the secure corridor. This time I told him we were coming directly to his office. He did not ask whether the hour was reasonable. David Rossi had never been a family attorney. He handled corporate warfare, emergency restructurings, hostile acquisitions, and the kind of litigation that caused public companies to lose half their value before lunch. 15 years ago, I had uncovered evidence during a liquidation that proved he had been deliberately framed by executives trying to shift criminal liability onto outside counsel. If I had stayed silent, his license, his career, and possibly his freedom would have disappeared. I did not save him because I liked him. I saved him because the numbers proved he was innocent. David never forgot it. He once told me that if I ever called before sunrise, he would assume the problem was serious enough to justify ruining his day. At 3:30 on Sunday morning, I finally collected on that promise. His downtown office was dark except for the conference floor. David was waiting in shirt sleeves with a pot of coffee, a legal pad, and the expression of a man who had already decided sleep was no longer relevant. The moment Caleb and I entered, he locked the suite behind us. I spread the copied power of attorney, the forged collateral documents, the court notice, and the Whitman Capital email across the glass table. Caleb opened his laptop and displayed the digital metadata, tying my cloned signature to the old commercial guarantor form. I expected David to react to the attempted kidnapping. Instead, he became almost unnervingly still. Lawyers who survive at his level do not waste outrage. They convert it into procedure. He read every page once, then again, then placed both hands flat on the table. His first recommendation was exactly what any responsible lawyer would make. "We file an emergency motion at sunrise," he said. "We ask the court to stay the conservatorship hearing, notify the clerk that the petition is based on forged documents, and seek an immediate protective order. We can stop Monday morning before it starts." Caleb looked at me with visible relief. For 1 second, the simple path hung in the air like an open door. We could stop the hearing. We could give the evidence to law enforcement. We could spend the next several months defending my property and helping prosecutors untangle Brandon's fraud. It would be safe. It would also be a mistake. "No," I said. David studied me over the top of his glasses. "Catherine," he replied, "the purpose of emergency relief is to prevent irreversible harm. You have enough evidence here to make a judge very uncomfortable with that petition." "I know," I said. "That is why we are not going to stop it." Caleb stared at me as if I had misunderstood my own danger. I had not. I walked to the window and looked down at the wet streets below. If we canceled the hearing, Brandon would know immediately that his fraud had been exposed. He still had hours before Whitman Capital's deadline. He could run. He could destroy records. He could move whatever cash he still controlled, abandon Chloe, blame the forged documents on his junior partner, or disappear before anyone obtained a warrant. A frightened fraudster with advance warning could become very difficult to corner. I turned back to David. "I want him confident," I said. "I want him to wake up Monday believing the court is still his exit. I want him to dress in his best suit, carry his forged evidence into a courtroom, place it in front of a judge, and swear that it is true. I want him to commit to the lie in the one place where every word matters." David's expression changed slowly. He understood the shape of the trap before Caleb did. "You do not want to defeat the petition," he said. "You want him to authenticate his own conspiracy in open court." "Exactly. And I want the financial motive waiting behind him when he tries to retreat." I tapped the Whitman Capital demand letter. $4 million of principal. $2 million due by 10 Monday morning. Brandon believes Whitman owns the leash around his neck. If we only stop the conservatorship, Whitman still controls the debt and Brandon still has a reason to flee. But if the debt changes hands before he walks into court, then his last escape route disappears without his knowledge. David leaned back, considering the mechanics. Buying an active, distressed loan on a Sunday would be difficult, even with ordinary access to banking. Buying it while my primary accounts were frozen would be worse. I reminded him of the private trust reserve that Brandon had never touched and the network of investors and restructuring professionals I had built over 30 years. The money existed. The problem was making it move while the conventional financial system slept. Caleb finally understood. "You want to buy Dad's debt," he said. I looked at him. "I want to buy the noose he tied for himself." For the next hour, David and I built the legal framework that would allow the purchase without exposing my identity. He prepared the formation papers for a neutral holding company that could receive an assignment of the Whitman loan. I chose the name Ironclad Holdings LLC because subtlety was wasted on people who would not discover the joke until it was too late. The ownership structure would remain shielded until we chose to disclose it. David mapped every document we would need: assignment of debt, proof of funds, default rights, acceleration provisions and notices that could be executed the instant Whitman accepted our offer. Nothing changed Brandon's original obligation. Nothing invented a new debt. We were simply preparing to step into Whitman's position as creditor. By the time the first gray light of Sunday touched the skyline, our defensive case was already strong enough to stop the conservatorship. I deliberately left it unused. On the table in front of us sat evidence of forgery, attempted abduction, and the exact financial deadline driving Brandon's desperation. Beside it sat the first pages of Ironclad Holdings. David looked from the documents to me and gave a slow, resigned nod. He had spent his career advising clients to reduce risk. He knew I was choosing to walk directly toward it. "Catherine," he said, If this works, Brandon will not know he has lost until he tries to escape. That is the point, I replied. I do not want him frightened into running. I want him standing under oath when the floor disappears beneath him. The sun rose over the city skyline, casting a harsh, unforgiving light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of David Rossi's downtown law firm. It was Sunday morning. The rest of the city was waking up to attend church services, drink coffee on their porches, and enjoy a day of rest. Inside the 15th floor conference room, there was no rest. There was only the bitter scent of stale espresso and the relentless ticking of a wall clock. I stood at the head of a massive glass table, staring at a whiteboard David had wheeled in from his private office. We had a catastrophic logistical problem to solve. I needed to legally purchase Brandon's $4 million debt contract from Whitman Capital before Monday morning. The financial markets were closed. Traditional banking institutions were completely locked down for the weekend. The Federal Reserve wire system would not process a single transaction until 9 on Monday morning. To the average citizen, moving millions of dollars on a Sunday was a physical and legal impossibility. But I was not an average citizen. I had spent decades as a corporate liquidator dismantling corrupt empires across international borders. I knew a fundamental truth about the global economy. Private equity never sleeps. Money is always moving somewhere provided you know exactly which shadow channels to use. David sat in a leather chair, rubbing his tired eyes behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "Catherine," he said, his voice raspy from the lack of sleep. "Whitman Capital is a predatory firm. They do not just hand over their active debt portfolios because someone asks nicely. Even if we can facilitate a Sunday transfer through an offshore clearinghouse, they have no incentive to sell you Brandon's contract. They want his collateral. They want to seize your commercial building tomorrow at 10. I picked up a black marker and drew a heavy line across the whiteboard. "Whitman Capital is a business, David." I replied, my tone sharp and pragmatic. "They deal in risk and reward. Seizing collateral requires a lengthy legal process. It requires liquidating a commercial property, paying broker fees, and dealing with tax penalties. I am going to offer them something much better. I am going to offer them immediate, undeniable, untraceable liquidity. I am going to buy the debt at a premium, and I am going to do it in cash." David looked skeptical. "Who exactly are you going to call to broker a multi-million-dollar debt purchase on a Sunday morning?" I reached for the encrypted satellite phone. "Not one person," I said. "A chain. Whitman Capital would never sell Brandon's paper because Catherine Brooks asked politely. They might, however, sell it if enough money appeared quickly, cleanly, and through channels they trusted. I had spent 3 decades dismantling failed companies, which meant I had also spent 3 decades learning which restructuring desks, private funds, and emergency capital pools could move when ordinary banks were closed. Most of those people were not friends. Friendship was irrelevant. They knew my record, and they knew that when I offered a number, the funds behind it were real. The first call lasted less than 4 minutes. I asked an old restructuring contact whether Whitman was actively shopping distressed commercial paper that weekend. I never mentioned Brandon's name until the contact confirmed that Whitman had been quietly testing the market for several troubled positions. The second call went to a private credit desk that had once competed with Whitman for a hotel portfolio. I asked what premium would make Whitman's managing director stop caring about the underlying collateral and choose immediate liquidity instead. The answer came back almost exactly where I expected, principal plus enough profit to remove the inconvenience of foreclosure. The third call was not a negotiation at all. It was verification. I had David compare the loan identification number from Brandon's stolen files against the assignment language we would need. Every step tightened the circle without exposing me as the buyer. Caleb watched the process from the end of the table, fascinated by how little I said. I did not threaten anyone. I did not explain my family crisis. I did not tell strangers that my daughter had tried to drug me. Corporate transactions did not move on sympathy. They moved on certainty. I gave each person only the information required for the next step, and within 40 minutes the shape of the market became clear. Whitman wanted the $4 million principal back. They also wanted compensation for surrendering the potential upside of seizing my retail plaza. If we offered $4.5 million with same-day execution, they would listen. A $500,000 premium, David said, looking down at the figures. That is an enormous amount to pay simply to take control of a bad loan. It is not payment for a bad loan, I replied. It is the purchase price of leverage. If Whitman forecloses, I spend months fighting to recover a building Brandon never had the right to pledge. If I own the debt, I control the timing, the remedies, and the evidence attached to the file. More importantly, Brandon walks into court believing Whitman is still waiting for his money. That belief is worth far more to me than the premium. We still had to solve the weekend funding problem. My ordinary American accounts remained locked behind the forged power of attorney exactly as Brandon intended, but the emergency trust I had established years earlier was legally separate, privately administered, and never linked to the household accounts Chloe knew about. David pulled the trust documents from the file I had retrieved at the bank. Caleb built a secure connection to the trust portal and verified that the reserve could be transferred through an international high-net-worth clearing channel that operated outside ordinary retail banking hours. The funds were mine. The trust was mine. Brandon had simply never known where to look. At 8:20 that morning, David sent Whitman Capital a formal expression of interest on behalf of Ironclad Holdings, LLC. The offer was deliberately brutal in its simplicity full principle. A $500,000 premium same-day closing, immediate proof of funds, no renegotiation after acceptance. We gave them a narrow window to respond. If they hesitated too long, the offer disappeared. Whitman had built its reputation by pressuring desperate borrowers with clocks. I enjoyed turning the same weapon back on them. The response came quickly. Whitman wanted more information about the buyer. David provided exactly what the law and transaction required, and nothing that would reveal my personal identity. They asked whether Ironclad understood that the underlying collateral could be challenged because of irregular signatures. David answered that the buyer had reviewed the risk and was acquiring the entire file as is, including all rights connected to fraud, default, and collection. That sentence mattered. We were not merely purchasing an income stream. We were purchasing the evidence package Brandon feared. Whitman countered with additional conditions designed to protect itself from future disputes. I read each one, struck the language that could weaken our remedies, and sent revised terms back through David. The negotiation became a rapid exchange of red-lined pages, proof of funds confirmations, and assignment clauses. Every time Whitman tried to preserve some future claim to the plaza, I removed it. Every time they tried to limit transfer of the fraud documentation, I restored it. I had liquidated companies for too long to let a predatory fund hide a knife in a footnote. By late morning, they agreed in principle. The debt would be assigned to Ironclad Holdings once the $4.5 million cleared into the designated holding account. Caleb sat beside me and watched the transaction screen while I authorized the release from the emergency trust. The numbers were staggering even to him. I felt no hesitation. Brandon and Chloe had tried to steal my legacy by turning age, family loyalty, and the courts into weapons. I was using a protected piece of that legacy to purchase control of the exact instrument they believed would save them. The transfer did not make a dramatic sound. No alarm rang. No one burst into the room. A line of text simply changed from pending to accepted. Yet that quiet change was the hinge of the entire war. Whitman Capital was now committed to surrendering the Hayes debt to Ironclad Holdings once the closing documents were fully executed. Brandon still believed he owed Whitman. He still believed he had until 10 Monday morning to steal $2 million from me. I had no idea. The creditor waiting at the end of that deadline was me. David looked at the draft assignment on his screen and then at the stack of formation papers beside him. The legal structure was almost complete. Caleb leaned back, for the first time in hours, exhaustion showing in his face. I did not relax. Until every signature was in place, a deal was only a promise. I checked the clock and returned to the documents. We had one day to turn a promise into a noose. The rest of Sunday became an exercise in precision rather than speed. David finalized Ironclad Holdings and matched every clause of the new company documents to the assignment terms Whitman had accepted. We reviewed the loan schedule, the default provisions, the collateral file, and the fraud-related correspondence one page at a time. I refused to let urgency create the kind of sloppy paper trail Brandon had relied on. If Ironclad was going to stand in court as the lawful holder of his debt, every date, signature, block, and transfer right had to survive hostile scrutiny. Caleb built a secure archive of the transaction record as it developed. He preserved the timestamps, confirmation notices, and document hashes, so no one could later claim that the assignment had been fabricated after the hearing. He also kept our connection isolated from the systems Brandon had already compromised. The work was quiet and repetitive, but that was the difference between revenge and evidence. Anger could produce a dramatic accusation. A complete audit trail could produce consequences. By afternoon, the substantive terms were locked. Whitman had accepted the economics of the deal, the protected trust had delivered the required funds into the agreed holding channel, and the remaining work was documentary countersignatures, final schedules, and the formal transfer of every enforcement right attached to Brandon's loan. I read each revised page before David released it. Whitman had spent months threatening Brandon with deadlines. Now they were the ones being held to one. The sun dropped behind the skyline while we waited for the executed assignment to return. No one celebrated early. A negotiated agreement was not enough. I wanted the final document showing that Whitman Capital had relinquished the debt and that Ironclad Holdings now stood in its place. Until that file arrived, the noose was only tied on paper. At exactly 8 in the evening, a notification chimed on Caleb's laptop. He opened the encrypted email. A massive PDF file downloaded onto the screen. David stood up and walked over, adjusting his glasses. He leaned over Caleb's shoulder, reading the legal text with intense focus. "It is a full assignment of debt," David announced, his voice thick with awe and relief. "Whitman Capital has officially relinquished all rights, titles, and interests in the commercial loan agreement of Brandon Hayes. The contract has been successfully reassigned to Ironclad Holdings, LLC." He looked up at me, a mixture of profound respect and slight fear in his eyes. "Catherine," David said quietly, "you did it. You own his debt. You own his collateral. You own the right to hand his forged signatures over to the FBI. Brandon Hayes is completely at your mercy, and he has absolutely no idea that his new master is you." I walked over to the window and looked out at the city lights. The trap was mathematically perfect. Tomorrow morning at 9, Brandon would walk into a closed-door court hearing and try to convince a judge to strip away my civil rights. At 10, he would try to use my money to pay off a ruthless investment firm. But the investment firm was no longer involved. When Brandon failed to pay the penalty tomorrow, I would not just defend myself. I would step out of the shadows, reveal myself as Ironclad Holdings, and annihilate him. The legal files were ready. The financial noose was tied. I took a deep breath, feeling a profound sense of vindication. Then the silence of the office was shattered by the frantic buzzing of a cell phone. Caleb pulled his phone from his pocket. He looked at the screen, his brow furrowing in confusion. "It is a notification from a social media platform. A bunch of my friends from church are suddenly tagging me in a video. Open it," I instructed, turning away from the window. Caleb tapped the screen. The video loaded, buffering for a brief second before expanding to fill his phone display. The setting was instantly recognizable. It was the fellowship hall of Grace Community Church, the exact same room where I had been sitting less than 24 hours ago. The lighting was bright. The room was packed with people. Standing at the front of the room, gripping the wooden podium with trembling hands, was my daughter, Chloe. She looked entirely disheveled. Her hair was messy. She wore no makeup. Her eyes were red and swollen, brimming with tears. She was giving the performance of a lifetime. "Please, everyone," Chloe sobbed into the microphone, her voice echoing through the church speakers. "I need your prayers tonight. My mother, Catherine, is experiencing a catastrophic mental breakdown. She has been suffering from paranoid dementia for months, and tonight she completely lost her grip on reality. My stomach plummeted. I stepped closer to Caleb, watching the digital broadcast with mounting horror. She ran away from the gala, Chloe cried, wiping a perfectly timed tear from her cheek. She was hallucinating. She thought my husband and I were trying to hurt her. She convinced my teenage son to drive her away in a stolen car. We have been searching for her all night. We are terrified she is going to wander into traffic or freeze to death on the streets." The camera panned across the crowd. I saw the faces of women I had known for 20 years, women I drank coffee with, women I had helped through divorces and illnesses. They were weeping. They were nodding in profound sympathy for my poor, devastated daughter. "We are working with the courts to establish an emergency medical conservatorship so we can bring her home safely and get her the psychiatric lockdown care she desperately needs," Chloe continued, her voice breaking with manufactured grief. "If anyone sees her, please do not approach her. She is highly delusional and extremely paranoid. Just call the police immediately. Please help me save my mother." The video ended. The silence in the law office was deafening. Caleb stared at his phone, his face completely drained of color. He scrolled down to the comments section. Thousands of messages were pouring in. People are saying you belong in a padded cell. Caleb whispered, his voice cracking with genuine trauma. The youth pastor just posted that he saw you looking confused at the gala. The catering manager commented that you looked unstable before you left. They are building a massive public narrative, Grandma. The entire community thinks you are a lunatic on the run. David rubbed his temples, looking grim. It is a brilliant smear campaign, Catherine. They are using the church to validate their medical claims. If you try to walk into that courthouse tomorrow, the bailiffs will recognize you from the video. They will not treat you like a respected businesswoman. They will treat you like an escaped mental patient. They will arrest you and hand you straight over to Brandon. Caleb looked up at me, tears of anger and betrayal shining in his young eyes. She is my mother, he said, his voice breaking. She stood in front of God and our entire community, and she lied to destroy you. How can people be this evil? He dropped his phone onto the glass table, overcome by the sheer cruelty of his own blood relatives. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I walked over to my grandson and placed my hands firmly on his shoulders. I pulled him into a tight, grounding embrace. I let him feel the steady, unwavering rhythm of my heartbeat. I needed him to understand that the tears of a liar hold no power over the truth. Do not let her break your spirit, Caleb, I said softly, my voice filled with a cold, terrifying resolve. This is the oldest trick in the corporate playbook. When a thief cannot win on paper, they try to win in the court of public opinion. They want to isolate us. They want to make us feel like the entire world is against us. I pulled back and looked him directly in the eyes. We are not going to defend ourselves on the internet, I stated, turning to look at David. We are not going to post a response. We are going to let them believe their public execution was a total success. Let them walk into that courtroom tomorrow morning feeling like absolute royalty. I picked up Caleb's phone and turned the screen face down on the table. Because tomorrow, I promised the temperature in the room dropping with every word I spoke, we are going to liquidate them in the only room where the truth actually matters. The fluorescent lights of David Rossi's law office felt completely sterile compared to the warm, tearful glow radiating from Caleb's smartphone screen. The video was playing on a continuous loop. My daughter Chloe was broadcasting live to the private Grace Community Church prayer group. She had framed the shot perfectly. She was sitting in the front pew of the empty sanctuary, the stained glass windows casting a sorrowful, muted light across her shoulders. Her hair was intentionally messy. Her makeup was deliberately smudged to simulate hours of frantic crying. "Please," Chloe sobbed into the camera, clutching a crumpled tissue against her chest. "I am begging our church family for help. My mother, Catherine, has suffered a complete mental collapse. She has been battling severe paranoid dementia in secret, and tonight she finally lost her grip on reality. I watched my daughter weave a masterpiece of character assassination. She looked directly into the lens, her voice trembling with the exact cadence of a shattered, desperate child. She fled the charity gala." Chloe continued, letting a single perfect tear roll down her cheek. She was hallucinating. She believed Brandon and I were trying to harm her. She even manipulated my sweet teenage son into driving her away. We have been driving through the streets all night looking for them. She is confused, terrified, and incredibly vulnerable. We are currently filing an emergency medical conservatorship with the courts so we can bring her home safely and get her the lockdown psychiatric care she so desperately needs. She leaned closer to the camera, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "If anyone sees her, please do not approach her. Her paranoia makes her highly unpredictable and dangerous to herself. Just call the police immediately so they can detain her for her own safety. Please pray for my mother." The video ended, plunging the conference room into a heavy, suffocating silence. Almost immediately, Caleb's phone began vibrating against the glass table. It buzzed once, then twice, then a continuous angry rhythm as a flood of incoming text messages lit up the lock screen. Caleb picked up the device. His hands were shaking so violently he almost dropped it. He swiped open his messaging app, his face drained of whatever color he had left. "It is everyone," Caleb whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of the betrayal. "The entire congregation is reacting. They are all tagging each other on social media. Read them to me," I commanded gently. I needed to know exactly how wide the blast radius of Chloe's lie had spread. Caleb swallowed hard, scrolling through the endless stream of notifications. Caleb opened another message from the church pastor. It urged him to bring me to the local emergency room immediately, insisted that Chloe was sick with worry, and warned him not to let my supposed delusions manipulate him. Caleb scrolled down his finger, trembling against the glass screen. Another message came from the choir director. It told Caleb he was too young to handle a dementia patient and urged him to call the police so I could be transported to a psychiatric ward. The wording was gentle. The effect was brutal. The messages kept pouring in, dozens of them, friends I had known for 20 years, women I had hosted for afternoon tea, men I had helped secure business loans for when their companies were struggling. Chloe had successfully weaponized the entire social structure of my life. She had painted a picture so compelling and so tragic that any attempt I made to defend myself would be instantly dismissed as the rambling paranoia of a diseased mind. "They believe her," Caleb said, dropping the phone back onto the table as if it burned his hands. "Every single person in our community thinks you are insane. They think you are a danger to yourself." David Rossi let out a long, heavy breath. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the dark, sleeping city. "It is a textbook character assassination," David stated, turning back to face the room. "And it is legally devastating. Chloe just poisoned the well. She has completely isolated you from your support network. If you walk into a police station right now and try to report Brandon for financial fraud, the desk sergeant is going to recognize you from that video. The police will not see a sharp corporate liquidator. They will see a confused, elderly woman experiencing a manic episode. They will place you on an involuntary psychiatric hold and call your daughter to come pick you up." I sat back in my leather chair, processing the sheer malice of my daughter's strategy. It was brilliant. It was suffocating. She had locked me inside a prison made of public pity. By portraying herself as the grieving, dutiful daughter, she had guaranteed that no one in modern American society would question her motives. "And what happens when we go to the courthouse on Monday morning?" Caleb asked, looking desperately at David. "What happens when Grandma tries to stand before the judge?" David adjusted his glasses, his expression grim. "The bailiffs are part of the local community, Caleb. The court clerks attend that church. By the time we walk through the metal detectors, everyone in the building will be whispering about the poor, deranged widow. Chloe has engineered an environment where Catherine's voice carries absolutely zero credibility." The reality of the situation crashed down on Caleb with crushing force. He was 19 years old. He had spent his entire life looking up to his parents, assuming they were inherently good people, despite their flaws. Tonight he had watched them attempt to drug his grandmother, forge legal documents to steal her fortune, and then publicly destroy her reputation with a tearful, calculated lie. Caleb covered his face with his hands. A sharp, broken sob tore through his chest. He bent forward, resting his elbows on his knees, weeping with a profound, agonizing grief. "She is my mother." Caleb cried, his shoulders shaking as the tears spilled through his fingers. "She went online and she lied to everyone we know. She smiled in my face my entire life, and she is a monster. How can she do this to her own family? How can people be this cruel?" I did not cry. I did not raise my voice in anger. I stood up from my chair and walked around the heavy glass table. I stopped beside my grandson and placed my hands firmly on his trembling shoulders. I did not offer him empty platitudes. I did not tell him everything would magically be okay. I offered him the hard, undeniable truth. "Look at me, Caleb," I said softly, my voice carrying the weight of decades spent fighting the worst kind of people. He slowly lifted his head. His eyes were red and swollen, brimming with a sorrow that threatened to break his spirit. "The world is full of people who view kindness as a weakness," I told him, looking directly into his tear-filled eyes. "Greed is a disease that rots the human soul from the inside out. Your mother and your father have allowed that disease to consume them. They looked at my lifetime of hard work, and instead of feeling gratitude, they only felt entitlement. They convinced themselves that they deserve the fruits of my labor." I pulled a handkerchief from my pocket and gently wiped the tears from his cheek. "But you must understand something very important about predators." I continued, my tone shifting into a cold, unbreakable resolve. "They always rely on your silence. They rely on the illusion of family loyalty to keep you compliant. Chloe expects me to be paralyzed by shame. She expects me to hide in the shadows because I am too embarrassed to fight back publicly." I squeezed his shoulder, forcing him to draw strength from my posture. "You are crying because you have a good heart," I told him. "You are grieving the mother you thought you had." But I am not crying. I stopped crying over Chloe a long time ago. Right now, her cruelty is not a tragedy. It is our absolute greatest advantage. Caleb sniffled, looking confused. "How is a viral smear campaign an advantage?" "Because arrogance breeds carelessness," David interjected, stepping away from the window and moving back toward the table. "Chloe and Brandon think they have already won. They think they have neutralized Catherine completely. They are going to walk into that courthouse on Monday morning feeling invincible. They are not going to be looking over their shoulders." I nodded, returning to my seat. "Exactly. Chloe thinks she has backed me into a corner where I cannot defend myself. But she forgot one crucial detail. I am not going to defend myself." I reached across the table and picked up Caleb's phone. The screen was still lighting up with pity-filled messages from church members and neighbors. It was a digital symphony of public humiliation. I held the device up so both Caleb and David could see it. "We are not going to record a rebuttal video," I stated, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "We are not going to log into the church forum and plead our case. We will not waste a single breath arguing with people who have already decided I am insane. Let them pray for my failing mind. Let them share my daughter's tearful performance. Let the entire city believe that Catherine Brooks has been defeated." I pressed the power button, shutting the smartphone down completely. The screen went black, cutting off the endless stream of notifications. I placed the phone face down on the table. "We will not defend ourselves on the internet," I declared, looking between my grandson and my lawyer. The air in the room felt suddenly charged with electricity. "We are going to let Chloe and Brandon step up to the podium. We are going to let them present their forged documents to the judge. We will let them feel the absolute thrill of their impending victory." I smoothed the lapels of my blazer, the Iron Widow fully awakened and ready for war. And then I said, a slow, terrifying smile spreading across my face, "We are going to liquidate them in the highest court." The city of Sacramento was quiet, wrapped in the dark, heavy blanket of late Sunday night. Inside the 15th floor conference room of David Rossi's law firm, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of bitter coffee and the electric charge of impending warfare. We had spent the last several hours constructing a legal and financial labyrinth from which my daughter and son-in-law would never escape. Caleb sat at the far end of the glass table, the soft blue light of his laptop screen reflected in his eyes. He was no longer the heartbroken teenager who had wept over his mother's betrayal earlier that evening. He had channeled all of his grief into pure, unadulterated focus. His fingers moved across the keyboard with a rhythmic, punishing speed. He was building the digital kill shot. "Is the payload ready?" I asked, walking over to stand behind his chair. "Almost," Caleb replied, his voice steady and devoid of emotion. "I am compiling everything onto a single encrypted USB flash drive." I structured the presentation so the judge will see the timeline exactly as it happened. First, the forged power of attorney and the signature metadata. Then the audio file from the break-in, followed by the Whitman Capital documents that prove motive. I watched as he dragged and dropped the files into the master directory. "I isolated the metadata on the signature line," Caleb explained, pointing to the screen. "I included a side-by-side comparison showing how Dad lifted your exact signature from that commercial lease 6 months ago. The pixel match is 100% identical. Then I added the email chain showing that one of his brokerage colleagues notarized the forged document. And the Whitman Capital extortion emails I asked, they are in the final folder," Caleb confirmed. I highlighted the exact paragraph where the private equity fund threatens to report Dad to the FBI if he does not pay them $2 million by 10 in the morning on Monday. It proves his entire motive. It proves he needed you declared legally incompetent at 9 so he could steal your money to save himself at 10. "Excellent work, Caleb," I said, resting my hand briefly on his shoulder. "You have handed us the sword. Now I will prepare the shield." I turned and walked to the other side of the conference room, where David was arranging stacks of thick legal documents. The digital evidence Caleb compiled was enough to keep me out of a psychiatric ward and send Brandon to prison. But criminal justice was a slow process. I wanted immediate, catastrophic financial consequences. I wanted my daughter and her husband to wake up tomorrow morning and discover they had absolutely nothing left. David handed me a sleek black pen. "The paperwork for Ironclad Holdings is fully executed, Catherine," he stated, pushing a towering stack of paper toward me. You are officially the sole owner of Brandon's $4 million debt. You hold the primary lien on all of his commercial collateral. I clicked the pen. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I signed my name and the bottom of the first page. By signing this notice of default, David explained, maintaining his rigid professional tone, you are officially accelerating his loan terms due to fraudulent activity. Brandon violated the morality clause of his original contract the moment he submitted a forged collateral deed. You are not just calling in the debt, you are legally freezing all of his personal and business accounts to satisfy the outstanding balance. I signed the second page, then the third. Every stroke of my pen was a nail in the coffin of Brandon's arrogant lifestyle. He had spent years leasing expensive sports cars, wearing custom suits, and looking down on people who worked honest jobs. Tomorrow his bank cards would be declined at the coffee shop. Now for Chloe, I said, pushing the finalized foreclosure notices back across the table. David produced a much thinner, more elegant-looking document. He looked at me with a mixture of professional awe and deep personal sympathy. Catherine, David began carefully. You established the generational wealth trust for Chloe over 20 years ago. It pays for her mortgage, her luxury vehicle leases, and her country club memberships. If you invoke the malfeasance clause tonight, you will completely sever her access to every single dollar. She will not be able to buy groceries on Monday afternoon. She went on the internet and told our entire community that I was a dangerous lunatic. I replied, my voice as cold as absolute zero. She watched her husband hire a medical contractor to drug me in a public church. She planned to lock me in a psychiatric facility for the rest of my natural life so she could steal the money I spent 3 decades earning. Do not ask me to feel sympathy for a woman who viewed my death as a convenient financial strategy. I took the trust document. I signed my name with brutal, unforgiving precision. I am not doing this out of spite, David. I continued, setting the pen down on the glass table. I am doing this because greed is a cancer. If you treat a cancer with a gentle touch, it will simply grow back and consume you. Chloe and Brandon believed they could outsmart the system. They believed my age made me weak. They need to understand that the consequences of their actions are absolute. David slowly gathered the documents, placing them into a thick leather briefcase. You are the most terrifying client I have ever represented, Catherine. I am just glad we are on the same side. I smiled briefly. Caleb walked over and handed me the encrypted USB flash drive. It was small silver and remarkably light, considering it held the power to destroy 2 lives. I slipped it into the pocket of my blazer. We need to finalize the tactical approach for the morning, David said, checking his watch. It was approaching 4 in the morning. We only had a few hours left until the courthouse opened. The ex parte hearing is scheduled for 9. David noted, drawing a rough timeline on the whiteboard. Chloe and Brandon will arrive early. They will meet with their probate attorney and go into the private chambers of Judge Thomas Sullivan. They will present the forged power of attorney. They will show the judge the viral video of Chloe crying in the church. They will paint a picture of a desperate, grieving family trying to save a sick old woman. And right before the judge strikes his gavel to make the conservatorship permanent, I will walk through those heavy oak doors, I said, crossing my arms. I will hand the bailiff this USB drive, and I will introduce Ironclad Holdings to the court. But there is a massive logistical problem, Caleb interrupted, pointing to his phone. The viral video, Caleb explained, his voice tight with anxiety. Mom's live stream has been circulating for over 30 hours now. It has thousands of shares. She specifically told everyone that you are dangerous and experiencing a severe psychotic break. She asked people to call the police on site. David nodded, his expression darkening. Caleb is right. The Sacramento courthouse is a highly secure building. You have to pass through a heavy security checkpoint just to get to the elevators. The bailiffs and the local police officers working that door are active members of this community. Many of them probably go to your church. They have all seen that video. If I try to walk through the front doors, I said, finishing his thought, they will not see a respected corporate liquidator arriving for a hearing. They will see an escaped mental patient. They will detain me for my own safety. Exactly, David confirmed. They will place you in a holding cell and call paramedics. By the time we can untangle the legal mess and prove you are completely sane, the 9 o'clock hearing will be over. Brandon will have his conservatorship. He will wire the $2 million to Whitman Capital at 10. He will win. The room fell totally silent. We had the weapon. We had the evidence. but the battlefield was surrounded by a wall of well-meaning citizens who believed my daughter's magnificent lie. "We need a way to bypass the security checkpoint," Caleb said, pacing the room. "Can we go through the loading dock? Can David claim you are a paralegal and sneak you in?" "No." David shook his head. "Security is too tight. They check identification for every single person entering the building. We cannot sneak a 68-year-old woman past 6 armed bailiffs." I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the first faint hints of dawn begin to turn the eastern horizon a pale, bruised purple. The storm from the previous night had passed, leaving the city streets slick and washed clean. "We are not going to sneak in," I stated, turning back to face my lawyer and my grandson. "We are not going to hide. We are going to walk through the front doors with our heads held high." How Caleb asked, completely baffled. "They will arrest you. Not if they cannot justify treating the woman walking through those doors as helpless," I replied. I left the conference room and walked down the hall to the private executive washroom attached to David's office. When we had visited my hidden safety deposit box at the private bank the previous night, I had retrieved more than just my emergency cash and my passports. I had retrieved my armor. For the past 10 years, I had played the role of the soft, retired grandmother. I wore floral blouses, soft cardigans, and comfortable walking shoes. I baked cookies and hosted church luncheons. That was the Catherine Brooks my daughter thought she was dealing with. That was the woman she described in her viral video. A frail, confused widow, losing her grip on reality. I unzipped the canvas garment bag I had brought from the vault. I stripped off the ruined tea-stained silk dress from the charity gala. I washed my face with cold water, scrubbing away the soft maternal makeup I usually wore. I brushed my silver hair straight back, securing it in a sharp, uncompromising twist at the base of my neck. Then I put on the suit. It was a custom-tailored, steel gray blazer with matching trousers. The cut was immaculate, designed to project absolute authority in boardrooms dominated by powerful men. I slipped my feet into a pair of black pointed toe heels. I fastened a heavy vintage silver watch around my wrist. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The grandmother was gone. The Iron Widow stared back at me. Her eyes were sharp, cold, and entirely devoid of mercy. I stepped out of the washroom and walked back down the hallway. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of my heels echoed against the marble floor. Caleb and David looked up as I entered the conference room. Both of them physically took a step back. The transformation was total. I did not look like a woman who needed a psychiatric evaluation. I looked like a woman who owned the building. Grandma Caleb whispered, his jaw slightly open. "You look terrifying." "Thank you, Caleb," I replied smoothly. It was 8:15 in the morning. We had exactly 45 minutes to cross the city, breach the courthouse security, and crash a private judicial hearing. David grabbed his heavy leather briefcase. Caleb slid his laptop into his backpack. We stood together near the glass doors of the office, a highly unusual strike team preparing for the final assault. "Are you ready for this?" Catherine David asked, his hand resting on the door handle. "Once we step into that courtroom, there is no turning back. You are going to completely destroy your own daughter in front of a superior court judge. The fallout will be absolute." I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold silver edge of the USB flash drive. I thought about the forged documents. I thought about the poisoned tea. I thought about my daughter sobbing on the internet, begging the world to lock me away. "I am more than ready, David," I said, adjusting the cuffs of my steel gray blazer. "Let us go show my family how a corporate liquidator handles a hostile takeover." We walked out of the office and stepped into the elevator. The doors closed, plunging us into the rapid descent toward the street level. My mind was completely clear. The evidence was secured. The financial traps were fully primed. The only obstacle remaining was walking straight past a phalanx of armed police officers actively looking for a deranged senior citizen. I smiled at my reflection in the polished elevator doors. The police were looking for a victim. They had no idea they were about to meet the executioner. At 8:37, David's car stopped at the courthouse entrance. The building looked different from the street than it did in photographs, heavier, colder, designed to remind everyone, approaching that personal stories became legal records once they crossed the threshold. Caleb adjusted his backpack. David checked his bar credentials and the hearing notice one final time. I looked through the glass doors at the security station inside. 2 uniformed officers were screening visitors beside the metal detectors. A television mounted near the ceiling showed the local morning news. For a moment, I could see the same church image Chloe had pushed across social media the night before. My daughter's performance had traveled exactly where she wanted it to travel. David turned toward me before we entered. Remember, he said, Chloe has created public suspicion. She has not obtained a lawful order authorizing anyone to seize you on site. You are the named subject of a conservatorship petition, and you have every right to appear with counsel. If someone tries to turn a social media allegation into a detention, I handle the legal argument. You handle yourself. I almost smiled. Handling myself had never been the problem. We walked through the front doors together. The first officer looked at David, then Caleb, then me. His expression changed. Recognition came quickly, not because of my face alone, but because he had clearly seen Chloe's video. His hand moved away from the plastic tray he was organizing. "Mrs. Brooks," he said carefully, "we received concerns that your family has been trying to locate you." David stepped forward without blocking me or raising his voice. "She is not missing," he said. "She is my client. She is here voluntarily for a scheduled Superior Court hearing in courtroom 4B, and I am counsel appearing with her." The officer looked uncertain. He glanced at me again. Chloe's entire strategy depended on that hesitation. She needed every stranger to interpret calm resistance as evidence of illness. I refused to give the lie any oxygen. "My name is Catherine Brooks," I said. "It is Monday morning. I am here for the 9 o'clock conservatorship hearing filed under my name. My identification is in the tray. My attorney is standing beside me, and I would like to proceed to the courtroom." I spoke without anger and without pleading. The officer checked my identification against the hearing notice David placed beside it. There was no arrest warrant, no judicial pickup order, no lawful directive declaring me incompetent. There was only a frightened daughter's public request that people treat me as if a judge had already ruled. The distinction was everything. The officer studied the documents, then looked toward David. "You understand there may be a welfare concern," he said. "Then document that she arrived oriented, coherent, represented by counsel, and voluntarily appearing before the exact judge assigned to determine that issue," David replied. "If the court orders an evaluation, we will comply with the court. Until then, my client is exercising her right to attend her own hearing." The officer did not argue. He returned my identification and motioned toward the metal detector. That small gesture broke the first wall Chloe had built around me. I placed my watch phone and the silver USB drive in a tray. Caleb did the same with his laptop. My steel gray blazer passed beneath the fluorescent lights, severe and immaculate. On the other side of the detector, I gathered my belongings without rushing. The second officer watched me more closely than he watched the people behind us. I could feel the question in his eyes. Was this really the confused widow from the video? That was why the suit mattered. It was not a disguise. It was evidence in cloth and posture. Chloe had asked the city to imagine a helpless woman wandering through a psychotic episode. I gave them a woman who knew exactly where she was going and exactly why. We entered the elevator at 8:42. Caleb exhaled so sharply it was almost a laugh. "I thought they were going to stop you," he admitted. "They tried to decide whether someone else's story about me was more reliable than the person standing in front of them," I said. "That is what your mother has been exploiting from the beginning." Age creates an ugly shortcut in people's minds. She thought if she said dementia loudly enough, everyone would stop asking for proof. David pressed the button for the courtroom floor. Today, they are going to ask for proof. The doors opened onto a quiet marble corridor. Through the tall windows at the far end, morning light reflected off the wet city streets. We moved quickly, but not secretly. David walked at my left shoulder. Caleb stayed at my right. A few people looked up as we passed, and one court employee did a visible double-take. Nobody touched me. Nobody had the authority to drag a competent woman away from the hearing that existed to decide whether she was competent. At 8:45, we reached courtroom 4B. Voices filtered through the heavy oak doors. Brandon's was the easiest to recognize. He was speaking in the smooth, reasonable tone he used with wealthy clients, explaining that his mother-in-law had become unpredictable and dangerous. Chloe murmured something about fear and sleepless nights. They were already performing. I looked at David. He gave one short nod. Caleb's hand tightened around the strap of his backpack. The USB containing the forensic evidence was secured inside. David carried the executed ironclad documents in his briefcase. I carried nothing in my hands. For the first time since the poison tea touched my lips, I did not need to pretend to be weak, sick, frightened, or confused. I pushed the doors open. The heavy oak clock on the rear wall of courtroom 4B ticked forward, its rhythmic sound slicing through the absolute stillness of the room. Judge Thomas Sullivan sat at the elevated mahogany bench, surrounded by the towering authority of the California judicial system. For the past decade, he had presided over countless emergency ex parte hearings. He had seen families torn apart by grief greed and the tragic, relentless progression of age-related cognitive decline. He considered himself a master of reading human nature. He could usually spot a fraudulent petition the moment a petitioner opened their mouth. Inside the courtroom, my daughter Chloe and my son-in-law Brandon were standing at the plaintiff's table. Through the small rectangular window in the heavy double doors, I had watched their performance unfold before I entered. Chloe wore a modest dark navy dress. She held a crumpled tissue in her hand, dabbing at her dry eyes with practiced theatrical sorrow. She leaned over the wooden partition, speaking in hushed, dramatic tones to the head court clerk. Brandon stood right beside her, playing the role of the steadfast, supportive husband. He wore his best tailored suit. His hair was slicked back. He handed a thick stack of paperwork across the partition to the clerk. I knew exactly what those papers were. It was the forged, durable power of attorney and the fabricated medical assessment from their hired doctor. Brandon checked his watch. He tapped his leather shoe against the floor. He was nervous. He was sweating under his expensive cologne. He knew that Whitman Capital was waiting for their $2 million wire transfer at 10 in the morning. He needed the judge to sign the final conservatorship order at 9. He was 15 minutes away from stealing my entire life savings and saving his own miserable skin. I had pushed the heavy oak doors open. They swung inward with a loud, resounding thud that echoed across the high ceilings of the empty gallery. I walked down the center aisle. My posture was absolutely rigid. My heels clicked against the polished hardwood floor in a slow, rhythmic, unyielding cadence. I wore the armor of a woman who had spent 30 years destroying corporate predators. My eyes were locked directly on my daughter. Chloe had turned around. For a fraction of a second, her face went completely pale. The tissue slipped from her fingers and fluttered to the floor. She stared at my steel gray suit, my perfectly styled hair, and the terrifying cold clarity in my eyes. She expected a shivering, hallucinating old woman to wander in off the streets. She did not expect the Iron Widow, but arrogance is a blinding disease. Her shock rapidly morphed into a twisted, delighted smirk. She actually let out a short, breathy laugh. She turned to Brandon and slapped his arm in excitement. She thought I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. She thought I had foolishly delivered myself right into their custody. Brandon mirrored her arrogant smirk. He puffed out his chest, pointing at me as he turned to the court staff. He loudly proclaimed that my presence in a business suit was proof of my manic hallucinations. He demanded the bailiff call medical security to place me in a holding cell. Judge Sullivan paid no attention to Brandon's loud, arrogant demands. The judge was focused entirely on the paperwork sitting on his desk. He spent a few quiet minutes reviewing the thick file Brandon had confidently submitted. The documents painted a heartbreaking, legally flawless picture of an elderly woman losing her grip on reality. There was a signed medical evaluation detailing severe paranoid dementia. There were sworn affidavits outlining erratic, dangerous behavior. It was standard, tragic, and seemingly unremarkable. Judge Sullivan picked up his black fountain pen, fully prepared to sign the temporary conservatorship order and grant Brandon and Chloe total control over my life. Then he lifted his head. He looked past the polished wooden partition. He looked past the smirking, arrogant posture of the son-in-law. He directed his gaze toward the defense table to evaluate the poor, incapacitated woman he was about to strip of her civil rights. His fountain pen froze in midair. The air in the courtroom seemed to instantly evaporate. The blood drained entirely from the judge's weathered face. His jaw slackened, and a sharp, sudden tremor traveled up his arm, causing the heavy legal file to slip from his fingers. It hit the wooden desk with a dull, flat thud. He was not looking at a disheveled, hallucinating mental patient. He was looking at a woman standing in a perfectly tailored steel gray blazer. Her posture was forged from pure titanium. Her silver hair was pulled back into a severe, uncompromising twist. Her eyes, cold, sharp, and intensely analytical, were locked directly onto his. Judge Sullivan felt a phantom chill wash over his entire body. I knew those eyes. He had seen them dismantle the most expensive defense attorneys in the country. My God, the judge whispered, his voice catching in the dry expanse of his throat. He completely forgot about the microphone resting on his desk. The soft, terrified whisper carried through the courtroom speakers. Is it really her? 20 years ago, Thomas Sullivan was not a respected Superior Court judge. He was a junior, wildly inexperienced assistant district attorney working in the Financial Crimes Division. He had been assigned to prosecute a ruthless corporate raider accused of embezzling hundreds of millions of dollars from working-class pension funds. The defendant had a legal team that charged $1,000 an hour. They buried Thomas in fabricated tax return shell companies and dead-end corporate filings. The young prosecutor was drowning. His career was on the verge of collapse, and a guilty man was close to walking free. And then Catherine Brooks walked into his office. She was an independent forensic accountant appointed by the Federal Oversight Committee. She did not wear a badge, and she did not carry a gun. But within 72 hours, she had completely obliterated the billionaire's defense strategy. She walked Thomas through a labyrinth of offshore holding companies, phantom real estate transactions, and dummy corporations registered in the Cayman Islands. She traced every single stolen dollar with terrifying surgical precision. She handed Thomas the exact offshore routing numbers needed to secure a conviction. When the billionaire tried to intimidate her during a brutal cross-examination, Catherine had smiled coldly and recited the hidden account trail from memory. Her forensic work helped secure a conviction and became one of the cases that established Thomas Sullivan's reputation as a financial crimes prosecutor. In the insular, high-stakes world of corporate law, Catherine Brooks was a legend. They called her the Iron Widow. She was an apex predator who hunted white-collar criminals for sport. Judge Sullivan stared at the woman standing in his courtroom. He looked back down at the medical evaluation sitting on his desk. The document claimed this woman was suffering from advanced cognitive failure. It claimed she was unable to balance a checkbook. It claimed she needed her son-in-law to manage her daily life. A dark, furious realization dawned on the judge. The paperwork was not just a mistake. It was a spectacular, audacious, criminally insane lie. Brandon Hayes misinterpreted the judge's shocked silence. The arrogant real estate broker assumed the judge was staring in horror at my inappropriate behavior. Brandon puffed out his chest, stepping closer to the judge's bench with a look of profound, artificial sympathy. "Your Honor," Brandon said, projecting his voice so everyone in the gallery could hear his fake concern. "As you can clearly see, my mother-in-law is deeply unwell. She is highly agitated. She wandered into this secure building completely unsupervised. My wife and I are terrified she is going to have a violent public episode. Please sign the order so we can have the medical security team escort her to the private transport van waiting outside. We just want to get her the psychiatric help she so desperately needs." Chloe stepped up beside her husband, nodding frantically. She wiped a dry eye with her tissue. "Please, Your Honor, she does not even know what day it is. She thinks we are trying to hurt her. It breaks my heart to see her like this." Judge Sullivan did not reach for his pen. He did not signal the armed bailiff standing near the jury box. Instead, his hand closed around the heavy wooden handle of his gavel. He brought it down against the sounding block with a single deafening crack. The sharp noise cut through Brandon's syrupy performance like a gunshot. The entire courtroom flinched. Brandon, caught off guard by the aggressive strike, blinked in confusion. "Your Honor, I assure you the medical documentation is completely certified. We just need your signature." Judge Sullivan leaned forward over the elevated bench. The lingering shock on his face had completely vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated judicial fury. He looked at Brandon not as a concerned family member, but as a deeply foolish criminal standing on a trapdoor. "Mr. Hayes," the judge said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register that made the court clerk stop typing entirely. "Do you have absolutely any idea who you are attempting to declare legally incompetent in my courtroom today?" Brandon faltered, his arrogant smirk slipping a fraction of an inch. "I am sorry, Your Honor. That is Catherine Brooks. She is my wife's mother. She is a retired widow suffering from severe dementia." Judge Sullivan let out a harsh, humorless laugh that echoed against the marble walls. "A retired widow," the judge repeated, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "Mr. Hayes, the woman standing 10 feet behind you is Catherine Brooks. She is a master forensic liquidator. 20 years ago, she audited a massive international fraud syndicate using nothing but a banker's box of redacted receipts and a calculator. She dismantled a criminal empire in less time than it takes you to lease a commercial storefront. She could audit this entire state in her sleep. The color drained completely from Brandon's face. The bronze tan he maintained so carefully turned a sickly ashen gray. He slowly turned his head, looking over his shoulder at me. Chloe stopped dabbing her eyes. Her hands froze in midair. Her jaw dropped open as the judge's words echoed through her mind. They had spent their entire adult lives viewing me as an endless ATM machine, a soft, comfortable grandmother who baked pies and handed out generous checks. They never bothered to ask what I actually did before I retired. They never wondered how I amassed a $6 million commercial real estate portfolio. "You are telling me," the judge continued, his voice rising in volume and intensity, holding up the fabricated medical document for the entire room to see that the Iron Widow suddenly forgot how to balance her own checkbook. "You are telling me that one of the most brilliant financial minds I have ever encountered in my 30 years of practicing law needs you, a mid-level real estate broker, to manage her daily affairs." Chloe took a shaky step backward, bumping into the wooden partition. "Your Honor," she stammered, her voice suddenly high and thin, cracking under the crushing pressure of the judge's revelation. "You do not understand. You saw the video. The entire church saw her breakdown last night. She ran away. She was hallucinating. The community knows she is sick." Judge Sullivan threw the forged medical document onto his desk with a look of absolute disgust. "I do not care about a viral video on the internet," Mrs. Hayes, the judge, snapped, leaning over the bench to glare directly at my daughter. "I care about perjury. I care about the submission of fraudulent medical documents to a superior court. You walked into my courtroom and attempted to use the judicial system to execute a hostile financial takeover against a woman who has forgotten more about corporate law than you will ever learn." Brandon began to sweat profusely. The collar of his custom-tailored shirt was suddenly too tight. He looked at the wall clock. It was 8:55 in the morning. His 10 o'clock deadline with Whitman Capital was rapidly approaching, and his guaranteed escape route had just been incinerated. He was trapped in a room with a furious judge, an unmasked corporate liquidator, and no access to the $2 million he needed to save his life. "Your Honor," Brandon stammered, holding his hands up defensively. "There has obviously been a misunderstanding. We relied on the medical paperwork we were given." He looked toward Chloe, searching desperately for a version of the story that could still survive. Chloe backed away from the table, clutching her tissue so tightly it tore between her fingers. Neither of them looked toward the exit yet. They were waiting to see whether the judge would let embarrassment remain their only consequence. They still believed the disaster could be contained if everyone agreed to call it a family misunderstanding. They were wrong. The liquidation was only beginning. I stepped out from behind the defense table. David Rossi moved to my left with his briefcase in hand. Caleb stood to my right, his posture rigid and unyielding. For the first time that morning, Brandon understood that we had not come merely to survive his petition. "What are you doing?" Catherine Brandon hissed, his voice dropping into a desperate whisper. I looked at him with absolute, terrifying serenity. "Turning attempted fraud into a misunderstanding is not an option, Brandon," I said. "You brought your documents into a court of law. Now the court is going to see what they are made of." I turned my gaze away from his sweating, panicked face and looked up at Judge Sullivan. The judge was watching me intently, recognizing the exact posture I had used 20 years ago, right before I destroyed a billionaire on the witness stand. "Your Honor," I announced, projecting my voice so every single word was etched into the official court record. "My daughter and her husband are not here because they are concerned about my medical health. They are here because my son-in-law committed massive wire fraud, and he needed to steal my entire life savings to prevent a private equity firm from handing his forged collateral documents over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation." A collective gasp rippled through the few court staff members present in the room. The bailiff immediately stepped away from the wall, his hand resting firmly on his radio, fully alert to the escalating situation. Chloe let out a sharp, terrified cry. "Mom, stop it! You are going to ruin us!" I ignored her completely. I kept my eyes locked on the judge. "I did not come here today to defend myself against a fabricated medical diagnosis, Your Honor. I do not need to prove my sanity to this court. I came here today to report a massive multi-million-dollar financial crime, and I brought the absolute proof to back it up. The magnificent, carefully constructed lie that Chloe and Brandon had built over the past 48 hours shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The viral church video, the poison tea, the fake doctor. It all meant nothing now. The court of public opinion had been stripped of its power. We were standing in a court of law, and I was holding the ultimate weapon. I stepped forward, moving away from my lawyer and my grandson. I walked directly toward the podium positioned in the center of the room. I did not look like a grieving mother. I did not look like a victim seeking protection. I reached into the pocket of my steel gray blazer and pulled out the encrypted USB flash drive Caleb had prepared. The silver metal caught the light of the courtroom overheads. "I am ready to proceed, Your Honor," I said, resting my hands firmly on the edges of the wooden podium. "Let us begin the liquidation." Judge Sullivan gave one curt nod, and the courtroom settled into a silence so complete that the faint hum of the ventilation system seemed loud. I remained at the podium while David opened his briefcase, and Caleb prepared the evidence beside him. For the next several minutes, I would not ask the court to believe my anger. I would ask it to follow the evidence. Brandon let out a strangled, breathless noise. He tried to speak. He tried to object and shout over me, but Judge Sullivan silenced him with a single furious raise of his hand. "You will remain entirely silent, Mr. Hayes." The judge warned, his voice rolling through the courtroom like thunder. "Mrs. Brooks has the floor, and I highly suggest you listen to every single word she says." I turned slightly and gestured to my grandson. Caleb stepped forward, his posture rigid, braving the wrath of his own parents. He handed me the silver USB flash drive. I held it up for the court clerk and the judge to see. "This drive contains the absolute irrefutable proof of their conspiracy," I stated. "I have provided digital copies for the court record, along with certified physical printouts of the entire forensic timeline." David Rossi stepped forward. He handed a thick, meticulously organized black binder directly to the court clerk, who quickly passed it up to the bench. Judge Sullivan opened the heavy binder. I narrated exactly what he was looking at. Tab 1 contains the metadata analysis of the durable power of attorney currently sitting on your desk, I explained, looking briefly at Brandon. "You will see that my signature is a digital clone. It was lifted pixel by pixel from a commercial lease document Brandon Hayes processed 6 months ago. Tab 2 contains the communication logs between Mr. Hayes and a corrupt junior notary who illegally stamped the forgery." Chloe gripped the edge of the plaintiff's table. Her knuckles were stark white. She abandoned her theatrical crying completely. "Mom, please," she whimpered, her voice shaking with genuine panic. "You are confused. You are making this all up." Tab 3, I continued, contains the audio recording Caleb started inside my house at 2 o'clock this morning, just before the break-in. It captures Brandon and Chloe discussing the plan to inject me with heavy sedatives, force me into a transport van, and confine me in a private psychiatric facility until the Monday hearing was over. Judge Sullivan's face turned a dangerous, furious shade of crimson. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the undeniable proof of my family's treachery. The room was so quiet I could hear the rustle of the heavy paper turning. Brandon was vibrating with pure panic. He looked at the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. He looked at the armed bailiff resting his hand on his radio. He realized the walls were rapidly closing in. He threw his hands up in a gesture of frantic, desperate surrender. "Your Honor, this is completely unnecessary," Brandon babbled, stepping away from the table and backing toward the aisle. "If my mother-in-law is going to be this combative and paranoid, we will just drop the matter. We formally withdraw our petition for conservatorship. We do not want the estate. We are leaving right now." He grabbed Chloe by the arm, yanking her toward the center aisle. He thought he could just hit the eject button and walk away. He thought he could slink back to his office, figure out a new scam, and somehow survive the 10 o'clock deadline with Whitman Capital. "You cannot withdraw your petition, Brandon," I said. My voice was a soft, razor-sharp blade that sliced right through his escape plan. "And you certainly cannot leave this room." He froze in the center aisle, turning back to glare at me. "Watch me," he hissed. "You seem to have forgotten your 10 o'clock appointment," I reminded him. Brandon stopped breathing. His eyes bulged. He stared at me as if I had just reached into his chest and crushed his heart. "Your Honor," I said, directing my attention back to the bench. "Tab 4 of your binder contains the final piece of the puzzle. It details a highly predatory loan agreement between Brandon Hayes and an equity firm named Whitman Capital. He borrowed $4 million to cover his catastrophic investment losses. He used my commercial retail plaza as collateral securing the loan with another forged signature. The judge reviewed the document, shaking his head in absolute disgust. Whitman Capital issued a final demand. I continued stepping away from the podium and walking slowly toward my son-in-law. They required a $2 million penalty payment by 10 this morning. If Brandon failed to pay, they promised to hand his forged documents over to the FBI. That is why he was so desperate to steal my life savings today. He needed to loot my accounts to pay off his loan sharks. Brandon's chest was heaving. You intercepted the emails, he gasped, backing away from me until his shoulders hit the wooden gallery benches. It does not matter. The deadline is in 30 minutes. Whitman is going to seize the building anyway. You lose Catherine. Even if I go down, you lose the plaza. I stopped right in front of him. I looked up into his sweaty, terrified face. Whitman Capital does not own your debt anymore, I stated clearly. They sold it last night at an 8 o'clock closing. Brandon blinked. The confusion on his face was absolute. Sold it. To who? To a private firm called Ironclad Holdings, I replied. I watched the exact moment the realization hit him. I watched the arrogant, greedy light completely die behind his eyes. And I am the sole managing director of Ironclad Holdings, I told him, dropping my voice to a lethal whisper. You are standing in front of your only creditor, Brandon. I own your debt. I own your collateral. And I am accelerating the terms of your loan due to egregious fraud. I pulled a folded legal document from my blazer pocket and pressed it flat against his chest. This is your formal notice of default, I said, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the courtroom. Ironclad is accelerating every remedy available under the loan. Any reachable equity in your mortgaged home, your business accounts, and the assets of your brokerage will be frozen or pursued according to law. The lifestyle you built on borrowed money ends today. Brandon let out a guttural, animalistic sound of pure defeat. The paper fluttered from his chest to the floor. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the wooden bench of the gallery, burying his face in his trembling hands. His custom suit suddenly looked like a cheap, wrinkled costume. Chloe stood frozen in the aisle. Her carefully crafted facade of the grieving daughter was entirely gone. She looked at her husband, destroyed and bankrupt. She looked at the judge, furious and disgusted. Then she looked at me. Mom. Chloe whispered, her voice cracking with genuine, desperate terror. Please, I am your daughter. You cannot do this to me. I will go to prison. I stared at her. I searched my heart for even a fraction of a solitary ounce of maternal sympathy. I found absolutely nothing. She had tried to erase my mind. She had tried to steal the wealth I spent 30 years building. She had smiled in my face while handing me a cup of poisoned tea. You stopped being my daughter the moment you crushed those pills, I told her quietly. Judge Sullivan brought his gavel down with a deafening crack. Bailiff the judge commanded, his voice filled with righteous, uncompromising authority. Take Mr. and Mrs. Hayes into custody immediately. Contact the federal authorities and the district attorney. We have massive wire fraud, grand larceny, elder abuse, and perjury occurring right inside this courthouse. 2 armed officers moved swiftly down the aisle. They grabbed Brandon by the arms, hauling him to his feet. He did not resist. He was entirely broken. When the officer grabbed Chloe's wrists, she started screaming. It was a loud, piercing, ugly sound. She thrashed against the bailiff, sobbing uncontrollably as the cold steel handcuffs clicked tightly around her wrists. You are a monster! Chloe shrieked at me, tears streaming down her face as they dragged her toward the side-holding cell. You are destroying your own family. I did not flinch. I watched them march her through the heavy wooden doors. The locks clicked shut. The screaming faded into the concrete corridors of the holding cells. They had walked into the courthouse expecting a coronation. They were leaving in the back of a police cruiser. They had lost their money, their freedom, and their dignity. The liquidation was absolute. I turned back to the judge. Thomas Sullivan looked down at me, a profound, quiet respect settling over his features. It is an honor to see you work again, Mrs. Brooks, the judge said softly. The court thanks you for bringing this conspiracy to light. Thank you, Your Honor, I replied with a slight respectful nod. I turned and walked back down the center aisle. David Rossi fell into step on my left, snapping his briefcase shut. Caleb fell into step on my right. We pushed through those heavy oak doors and stepped out into the bright, bustling hallway of the courthouse. The morning sunlight was streaming through the massive glass windows, casting long, triumphant shadows across the marble floor. The air felt clean. It felt like freedom. I stopped and looked at Caleb. He was watching the doors where his parents had just been taken away. His face was a mixture of deep sorrow and quiet relief. He had made an impossible choice. He had betrayed his own blood to protect an innocent life, and he had carried himself with the bravery of a seasoned warrior. "Are you all right, Caleb?" I asked gently. He took a deep breath, adjusting the strap of his backpack. "I will be," he said, offering me a small, tired smile. "It is just a lot to process." "You showed incredible courage," I told him, placing my hands firmly on his shoulders. "You are the only person in this family who truly understands the value of integrity. Because of you, I have my life and my freedom. I intend to make sure you have the exact same thing." I had already made the decision the night before. I was going to rewrite my estate plan so that Caleb's educational trust was fully protected from Chloe and expanded enough to cover his cybersecurity degree, housing, and the foundation of an independent future. My commercial holdings would be placed under professional administration, so no family member could ever weaponize them again. Caleb had not earned a kingdom by blood. He had earned my trust by choosing integrity when it cost him almost everything. We walked out of the courthouse and descended the grand concrete steps. The bustling noise of the city rushed up to greet us. People were hurrying to work, grabbing coffee, living their ordinary, completely unbothered lives. I paused at the bottom of the stairs and looked out at the street. Society often tells us that blood is thicker than water. People insist that family is an unbreakable bond, a sacred pact that requires endless forgiveness and infinite sacrifice. But sometimes blood is just poison wearing a familiar face. Sometimes you have to take a sharp axe and cut off a deeply necrotic branch before the rot spreads and kills the entire tree. When I watched the bailiff place those steel handcuffs on my own daughter, I did not shed a single tear. I felt no regret. I felt no sorrow. I only felt the profound, satisfying weight of justice being served to a pair of ruthless predators. People might look at me and think I am a cold, unforgiving woman. They might say that destroying your own child is an act of sheer malice. But I have to ask you, do you think a mother doing this is simply too cruel? Or do you think this is just the inevitable, terrifying price of boundless grief?